Him standing on the side of an old two-lane road deep in Scott County, Virginia. Today, it's just a quiet stretch of asphalt winding through the ancient woods of the Blue Ridge. The only sounds are the wind moving through the hickories and the distant cry of a hawk. But this isn't just any road. This is a place of echoes, because it was right here, nearly 100 years ago, that the silence was shattered by a struggle that ended a life and began a legend. A beloved young schoolteacher vanished from this very spot, leaving behind nothing but her car, her hat, and a mystery that haunts these mountains to this day. Let's turn back the clock. Forget the asphalt beneath my feet, and imagine a ribbon of red clay and gravel snaking its way through these same mountains in the fall of 1928. This was a world caught between two ages. Cabins with smoke curling from their stone chimneys stood not far from homes with newfangled telephones. Men still lived by the seasons and the old codes of the mountains, but the hum of the modern world was growing louder, carried in on the radios and the new automobiles that were just beginning to appear on these rough-and-tumble roads. Into this world stepped June Crabb. At 21, she was the very picture of that modern world. She was educated, bright, and filled with a quiet determination that set her apart. She was the teacher at the little one-room, big-cut schoolhouse, a position of immense respect in a community that valued learning but had few who could provide it. She represented a promise, a bridge between the old ways of the mountains and the possibilities of the world beyond. Every morning, she would make the drive to her schoolhouse, and every afternoon, she would drive back. And she did it in her very own Ford coupe. You have to understand what a sight that was back then. In a land where most people still relied on a mule or their own 2 feet, a young woman, independent and in command of her own machine, was a powerful symbol. That car wasn't just transportation, it was a declaration of freedom. It was her future, rolling along the dirt roads of the past. Her students adored her. For the children of coal miners and farmers, she was a window to a bigger life. She taught them arithmetic and literature, but more than that, she taught them that a girl from Scott County could achieve anything. At home, she was a beloved daughter. Her family, especially her father, saw in her the fulfillment of a dream, that their children would have more opportunities than they ever did. June Crabb wasn't just a person. She was the pride of her family and a beacon for her community. But this land, for all its beauty, held a deep and abiding sense of isolation. The forests that surrounded these roads were dense and ancient, capable of swallowing any secret. It was a place where everyone knew each other's business, yet the most important things often went unsaid. The very independence that made June a symbol of progress also made her a solitary figure on that lonely drive home, a single point of light traveling through miles of deep, dark woods. On the afternoon of Friday, September 14th, she dismissed her students for the weekend, gathered her books, and started her Ford coupe for a journey she had made countless times before, completely unaware it would be her last. Now, I'm not a detective from 1928. I don't have access to the original evidence bag, but local archives, God bless them, they keep everything. And in the files for this case, there are detailed descriptions and, in some accounts, a grainy photograph of the most important clue found at the scene. It's a simple thing, really. A lady's cloche hat, the kind every fashionable young woman wore in the 1920s. Looking at a picture of it, you can almost feel the felt. It's unassuming, maybe with a small ribbon or a simple pin. But this hat is the key to understanding the first terrifying moments of June's disappearance. Her school books were on the seat, her paycheck was in her purse, but her hat was on the floorboard of the car, reportedly scuffed and slightly crushed, as if it had been knocked from her head in a sudden violent motion. You see, back then, a hat wasn't just an accessory. It was an essential part of a woman's public identity. A respectable young teacher like June would no more leave her car without her hat than she would without her shoes. Its presence on that floorboard was a silent, desperate scream. It told the searchers, and it tells us now, that this wasn't an elopement. This wasn't a young woman running away. She was taken, ripped from her car, fighting for her life. This simple, forgotten object transforms the scene from a mystery into a portrait of violence and raises the chilling question, who in this tight-knit community would dare to lay hands on June Crab? The truth is, the deepest dangers in these mountains rarely come from a faceless stranger passing through. The real threats have names and faces and history. And while the lawmen looked for some wandering tramp, the whispers in the hills told a different story. They spoke of a young man, the son of a family whose name carried the weight of land, money, and influence. A young man who walked through the world as if he owned it, because in many ways he and his family did. He'd taken an interest in June Crab. It was the kind of attention a hawk pays a songbird. He saw her independence not as something to be admired, but as a challenge. He saw her beauty as something he was entitled to. By all accounts, he made his intentions known, expecting her to be flattered by the attention of a man from such a powerful clan. But June Crab was not a prize to be won, and she was not easily intimidated. She turned him down. Politely, the stories say, but with a firmness that left no room for argument. And for a boy raised to believe the world owed him everything, that simple no, delivered in plain sight of the community, was a public slap in the face. It was an insult to his pride, and more importantly, to the pride of his family name. The tension began to simmer then. A resentful stare held a second too long at the town mercantile, a muttered comment about the city girl teacher and her fancy automobile. It wasn't just a personal rejection anymore. To him and to his kin, June Crab and everything she represented, her education, her confidence, her refusal to bow to the old order of things, was a threat. The conflict wasn't over a single word. It was a clash between the old power of blood and land and the new power of a woman's own will. And in the heart of Appalachia in 1928, that was a conflict that could only fester and grow, like a poison ivy vine climbing the side of an old stone wall. These old mountain stories don't live in dusty court records. They live in people. They're passed down from grandmother to granddaughter, whispered over quilting frames and snapping beans on the porch. To find the heart of this story, you have to find one of those keepers of memory. I found one, an elderly woman living in a small white house not 5 miles from where June Crab's car was found. Her mind is as sharp as a newly honed axe, and her great-aunt was one of June's closest friends. She sat me down in her living room, a room filled with the quiet ticking of a grandfather clock and the scent of lemon oil and old wood. She told me the official story of the jilted lover was close, but it missed the most important part. It wasn't just a private rejection. It was a public humiliation, the kind a powerful family in these parts would never, ever forgive. It happened at the church social, just a few weeks before, she said, her voice a soft, papery rustle. The young man from that powerful family, full of corn liquor and arrogance, cornered June by the dessert table. He wasn't asking for her company. He was telling her she would grant it. In front of half the county, he tried to put his hand on her, to claim her like a piece of property. And June, in her quiet, dignified way, moved his hand off her arm and put him in his place. Her great-aunt said she didn't yell or make a scene. She just used words, calm, clear, and sharp as glass. She told him that her time and her person were her own, and not for him to command. The crowd went silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the grass. The young man's face went from white to red, and the look in his eyes, the old woman told me her aunt had said, was a look of pure, murderous rage. He had been shamed in front of everyone by the very woman he sought to possess. My great-aunt always said that was the moment it was sealed, the woman finished, looking out her window towards the mountains. It wasn't about love anymore. It was about pride. And around here, a man's pride, especially a man from a family like that, well, it's a dangerous and fragile thing. She said his pride had been so badly broken, the only thing that could mend it was to break her. That public shaming at the church social was a lit fuse. For the young man, the laughter he imagined behind cupped hands, the knowing glances exchanged between neighbors, it was all a torment. But for his father, the patriarch of the clan, it was something far worse. It was a stain on the family name, a challenge to the authority they had held in these mountains for generations. In their world, power wasn't just held, it had to be seen to be held. And a young schoolteacher, an outsider in their eyes, had openly defied them and walked away unscathed. Shame in that world was a living thing. It sat at the dinner table with them, a silent, unwanted guest. It followed them into town, and it demanded to be cleansed. The discussions that followed were not about forgiveness or letting things go. They were quiet, cold, and took place in the shadows of the porch after dark. They were discussions of honor, of lessons that needed to be taught. The phrase that would have been repeated in one form or another was simple and deadly. She can't be allowed to get away with that. June likely felt the shift in the air, a friendly nod in town that was no longer offered, the sudden silence that fell when she entered the general store. Friends of her family may have even offered veiled warnings, telling her to be careful on her drive, to not stop for anyone. But June Crabbe was cut from a different cloth. She would not be scared away from her school, from her students, or from her life. She would not let a bully's pride dictate her path. Her courage, the very thing that made her so remarkable, was now painting a target on her back. The decision, when it was finally made, wasn't likely a shouted, furious thing. It was probably a quiet nod between father and son, a confirmation. The goal wasn't just to scare her. That time had passed. The goal was to erase the insult, to reassert their dominance in a way that would be so final, so absolute, that no one would ever dare challenge their family's honor again. They knew her schedule. They knew every curve and hollow of Fincastle Road. They knew the place where the woods grew thickest and the nearest house was miles away. The plan was set. The trap was baited with the mundane routine of a Friday afternoon. The point of no return had been crossed, not in the heat of a public argument, but in the cold, calculated whisper of a family's wounded pride. So I've come back to the spot on Fincastle Road. The modern pavement is a black scar laid over the memory of the old red clay, but the bones of the land haven't changed. And when you stand right here, you understand why they chose this place. The road takes a sharp, blind curve. On one side, the mountain falls away into a steep, wooded ravine. On the other, the forest floor rises up, thick with underbrush and ancient trees that crowd right up to the shoulder. There are no houses, no fields, just the road and the woods. There are no bullet holes in a wall here, no lone chimney standing against the sky. The scars on this landscape are more subtle. They are the tactical advantages of the terrain itself. This blind curve is a natural ambush point, a place where a waiting car could be hidden until the last possible second. The dense wall of trees is a perfect backdrop for a man to step out of, blocking the way. The silence itself is the evidence. Even now, with the world just a few miles away, this spot feels utterly and profoundly isolated. Right here, this patch of gravel on the shoulder of the road. You can almost see the ghosts. You can almost feel the change in the air as a familiar drive home turned into a nightmare. This is where June Crabbe's Ford coupe slowed to a stop. This is where a shadow detached itself from the other shadows of the forest. Each stone on this roadside, each root snaking out from the bank, is a silent testament to the terror of that afternoon. This is the stage, perfectly set for the heart of darkness that was about to unfold. As June rounded that last blind curve, the familiar rhythm of her journey home was broken. Another car, dark and hulking, was stopped sideways, completely blocking the narrow road. It was an unnatural sight, a silent black predator waiting in the path. Her foot moved to the brake, her mind racing through possibilities. Engine trouble, an accident. But the cold knot that formed in her stomach told her this was no chance encounter. This was a barricade, a trap. The driver's side door of the other car opened, and the young man from the church social stepped out. He was not alone. His father, or perhaps another man loyal to the family, emerged from the passenger side. There was no rage on his face now, only a flat, chilling sense of purpose. He walked slowly toward her Ford coupe, his boots crunching on the gravel, the sound unnaturally loud in the afternoon stillness. Junet's hand instinctively went to the door lock, but it was too late. The handle of her car door was wrenched from the outside, the metallic click echoing like a gunshot. The door was pulled open, and the last of the afternoon sun was blotted out as the man's shadow fell over her. There was no shouting, only a low, guttural command to get out, the air filled with the scent of whiskey and rage. What followed was a chaos of muffled sounds, a sharp, terrified intake of breath, the scuffing of her shoes against the running board, the ripping of fabric. Her hat was knocked from her head, tumbling to the floorboard in a confused blur. A single piercing cry for help escaped her lips, but it was immediately swallowed by the vast, indifferent wilderness. The struggle was brief, brutal, and unequal. A moment later, the heavy slam of another car door echoed through the trees. Her own Ford coupe was left abandoned, its door still swinging slightly as if in a final silent wave goodbye. The waiting car roared to life, its tires spitting gravel as it turned and sped away, carrying June Crab deeper into the mountains, away from the road, away from everything she knew, and away from any hope of rescue. They drove for what must have felt like an eternity, turning off the main road onto a rough, barely there track that climbed higher into the wild heart of Clinch Mountain. The journey ended in a remote, briar-choked hollow, a place of deep shadows where the sun rarely touched the ground. They pulled her from the car. The final moments of her life were not witnessed by any person who would ever speak of it. There was no trial, no judge, no jury. Just the cold, hard finality of mountain justice. In the profound silence of that secluded place, a terrible act was committed. The only sound was a sudden, panicked flurry of wings as a flock of birds, startled by the violence below, erupted from the treetops and scattered into the darkening sky. Then, an awful, profound quiet settled back over the hollow. The men left as they had come, two ghosts melting back into the twilight, confident that the mountain would hold their secret forever. They left behind a life extinguished, a promise broken. The silence that returned was heavier than before, weighted with the knowledge of what it now concealed. In that forgotten thicket, the only thing that moved was a single oak leaf, spiraling slowly down to rest on a patch of newly disturbed earth. After the raw violence of the story, you turn to the official record, hoping for answers, for clarity. Instead, you find a different kind of coldness. I'm looking at copies of the pages from the Scott County Sheriff's file on the disappearance and death of June Crab. The paper is yellowed, the ink faded, but the words still tell a story, just not the one you're looking for. It's a story told in the dry, emotionless language of bureaucracy, a language designed to record facts while stripping them of all their human horror. Take the coroner's inquest, filed after her remains were found. It's a single page. Under cause of death, the report simply states, fractures of the cranium due to blunt force trauma. Just 6 clinical words to describe the brutal end of a vibrant, 21-year-old woman's life. It doesn't mention the lonely hollow, the terror of her final moments, or the year and a half her father spent walking these mountains, praying for a sign. The only humanizing detail is a small note. Remains identified by a gold-filled molar consistent with dental records. A life reduced to a footnote in a ledger. But it's the sheriff's investigative notes that are the most telling, mostly for what they don't say. There are pages and pages detailing the search efforts, listing the names of volunteers and the areas they covered. There are dozens of dead-end leads scribbled down, reports of a suspicious-looking tramp seen miles away, a vague tip about a car from Tennessee. The official narrative being built on these pages is clear. This was the work of a phantom, An outsider who drifted in, did this terrible thing, and vanished. Yet as you read through the file, a glaring omission becomes a roar. The name of the powerful local family, the name everyone in the county was whispering, appears nowhere in these pages. Not once. There's no record of the son being questioned, no mention of the public incident at the church social. The official record is a perfect portrait of a blind eye being turned. It's a meticulously crafted document that leads everywhere except to the one place everyone knew to look. These papers aren't evidence of a failed investigation. They are the evidence of a successful and chillingly effective cover-up. In the weeks and months that followed June's disappearance, the mountains swarmed with men. It was a manhunt of epic proportions, a genuine outpouring of a community's grief and rage. Thousands of volunteers, their faces grim and determined, beat the bushes from sunup to sundown. They were honest, hard-working men, searching for a beloved teacher, hoping to bring a killer to justice. But the official arm of the law, the sheriff and his deputies, seemed to be working from a different map. While the volunteers combed the hollows near Fincastle Road, the sheriff was busy chasing phantoms. Every report of a stranger, a vagrant, or a man with an out-of-state accent was treated as a major lead. Posses were dispatched on wild goose chases, riding 20 miles in the wrong direction to question some poor, itinerant worker who couldn't have possibly been involved. They created a grand spectacle of a law enforcement agency working tirelessly to hunt down an outside evil. It was a brilliant piece of theater. It kept the community busy and directed the collective anger safely away from anyone with a powerful local name. After her body was found, the performance had to move from the mountains to the courthouse. A grand jury was convened, not to seek the truth, but to officially bury it. For days, witnesses were brought in, but they were the ones who had seen a suspicious tramp near the railroad tracks or an unfamiliar car on a distant road. The people who had been at the church social, the ones who had seen the public confrontation and the look of murderous rage on the young man's face, were never called to testify. The questions were carefully chosen, the path of inquiry meticulously routed around the truth. The verdict wasn't delivered in a packed courtroom by a jury foreman. It was delivered on the courthouse steps by the county prosecutor, a man who knew which families buttered his bread. He stood before the small crowd of reporters and heartbroken townspeople, his face a perfect mask of solemn regret. He announced that after an exhaustive investigation, the grand jury had found insufficient evidence to issue an indictment. He spoke of trails gone cold and the tragic reality of motiveless, random violence. With those few legal phrases, the case was officially closed. Justice had not been blind. It had been deliberately blindfolded. The law had pursued its course, but it was a course designed to lead to a dead end. As the crowd dispersed in a quiet, defeated murmur, the men from the powerful family, who had been watching from the back, could turn and walk away. The hunt was over. The law had pursued its quarry, and in the end had declared the monster to be a ghost, allowing the real flesh-and-blood killer to retreat back into the safety of the shadows, protected by a wall of money, power, and fear. Every story eventually ends in a quiet place like this. Him standing in an old church graveyard on a hill overlooking the valley, where the wind whispers through cedar trees, and the only sound is the crunch of my boots on fallen leaves. Most of the headstones are old, tilting, and covered in a soft green carpet of moss. But June Crabb's grave is not hard to find. Her family and those who remembered tended to it for years. It's a simple, modest stone with a small carved lamb at the top, a symbol of innocence. The dates carved into the weathered marble tell the whole tragic story. 1907, 1928, 21 years, a life that had barely begun. You stand here before this quiet stone, and you feel the weight of all that lost potential. The students she would have taught, the family she never had. It's a place of profound and lingering sadness. But the story doesn't end with this single stone. Because just 100 yards away, up on the crest of the hill, where the most prominent families are buried, there is another plot. It's a grand affair, marked by a large, polished granite monolith, the family name carved in big, proud capital letters for all the world to see. And there, in the shadow of that monument, is another grave. It's the grave of the young man who could never accept the word no. His dates tell a different story. He lived a long, full life, dying of old age, surrounded by family. They lie so close now, separated by a small patch of grass and an immeasurable gulf of sin. He, the perpetrator, under a proud stone proclaiming his family's legacy. She, the victim, under a humble marker of a life stolen away. You can't help but notice the cruel irony. Enemies in life, neighbors in death, resting in the same Appalachian soil. Looking from his grave back to hers, you're left with a haunting question. The law couldn't touch him. The community was too scared to. But what happened after? What was it like to live out those 60 or 70 years knowing what you had done? What shadows followed him home from that courthouse, and did they ever leave him be? After the courthouse doors closed and the official story was written, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over Scott County. For the Crabb family, it was the silence of a home hollowed out by grief. The light simply went out of their house. Junet's father, a man who had tirelessly walked every inch of these mountains searching for his daughter, was a broken man. He had lost his child, and then he had been forced to watch as her killer walked free, shielded by the very system that was supposed to protect them. They had no recourse, no appeal. To speak the truth aloud would have been to invite ruin, or worse, upon the rest of their family. So they carried their sorrow quietly, a private agony that would follow them to their own graves. For the young man and his family, life went on with an almost defiant normalcy. He married a girl from a neighboring county, had children, and in time became a respected businessman, just like his father. Their name continued to be synonymous with power and influence. They attended church on Sundays, donated to local causes, and held their heads high. They had proven their point. They were the law in these mountains, and their honor was worth more than a young woman's life. Their victory was total. They had not only silenced June Crabb, they had silenced justice itself. But the stories that have been passed down say that the victory was a hollow one. They say the young man, as he grew older, was haunted. Not by a ghost in white, but by something far worse, a perfect, unending memory. He took to drinking heavily, and his temper, which had always been a spark, became a raging fire. People learned to give him a wide berth. He never, ever took the Fincastle Road again, even if it meant adding an hour to his journey. He lived a long life, but it was a life lived in a prison of his own making, forever looking over his shoulder, not for the law, but for the face of a girl he had left in a briar-choked hollow on Clinch Mountain. The community, too, lived under that long shadow. They knew the truth. Every man, woman, and child knew who had done it, and they knew why nothing was ever done. The case of June Crabb became a quiet, bitter lesson in the two kinds of justice that existed in the mountains, one for the common folk and another for the powerful. It bred a deep and lasting distrust that soured relationships for a generation. Justice had been denied, but memory is a different kind of court, and in the minds of the people of Scott County, the verdict was never in doubt. To this day, the murder of June Crabb isn't a settled piece of history around here. It's a living wound, and if you try to touch it, you'll find it's still tender. The story has fractured over the decades, becoming a testament to the fact that the past is never really dead. Depending on which family you ask, you will get two starkly different, irreconcilable versions of the truth. Ask anyone whose family has been in these hills for a century, especially those with a connection to the Crabb family, and they'll tell you the story I've just told. They'll speak of June as a bright light, a symbol of innocence who was sacrificed on the altar of a powerful family's pride. To them, the case is a defining local tragedy, a story of an unforgivable crime compounded by an unforgivable cover-up. It is a cautionary tale about how money and influence can poison the very soul of a community and place a family above the law. In this version, the guilt is absolute, the injustice is clear, and the memory of June is that of a martyr. But there are still a few who hold to a different telling. If you could find a descendant of that other family, and if they would even speak to you about it, they would tell you a tale of slander. They'd say their ancestor was a good, hard-working man, and that his family's success bred jealousy and vicious rumors. They would dismiss the story of the church social as malicious gossip, a tale spun by lesser men to tear down their betters. They would point to the official record, to the sheriff's tireless hunt for a nameless tramp, as the real truth. In their version, their family is the victim, unfairly maligned for generations by a lie that took root and grew into an unkillable weed. And there you have it. Two stories, two histories, occupying the same small patch of earth. One is a story of absolute guilt, preserved in the whispers of generations of ordinary people. The other is a story of absolute innocence, preserved by a family's defiant pride and backed by the clean, empty pages of the official record. The real, objective truth of what happened in that hollow probably died with the last person who was there. What we're left with are conflicting legacies. It's no longer just a question of what happened. It's a question of who you believe, and the answer says as much about you as it does about the past. When official justice fails in a place this isolated, the people find their own way to keep the truth alive. The story doesn't die. It just changes form. It escapes the dry, dusty pages of the official record and seeps into the local folklore. The hard edges of fact begin to soften and blur, and slowly, surely, a true crime story transforms into a full-blown Appalachian legend. Ask around today about June Crab, and some of the old-timers will tell you about the ghost of Fincastle Road. They say if you drive that lonely stretch of pavement late on a September evening, just as the fog is starting to settle in the hollows, you should watch the shoulder of the road carefully. They say you might see her, a figure in a simple dress, her face pale in the headlights, forever walking that final mile, trying to get home. Some even claim to have heard a single terrified cry carried on the wind, a sound that the mountains swallowed once and have been echoing ever since. But more than just a ghost story, her tragedy became a cautionary tale, a lesson whispered from mothers to daughters for generations. Her name became a warning about the dangers that can hide behind a neighbor's smile, a warning about the deadly fragility of a powerful man's pride. Her murder was no longer just a singular event. It was a living piece of folklore, a map of the hidden dangers that lay beneath the serene surface of their world, a brutal reminder that civilization is sometimes just a thin veneer stretched over something much older and wilder. This is the final stage of a story's life. It's how a community holds on to a truth that was officially denied. They turn the unbearable facts of history into the enduring power of a legend. The names of the guilty men might be spoken only in hushed tones, but the spirit of the story, the ghost of it, remains forever a part of the landscape, a permanent chill in the air on an otherwise quiet country road. So we find ourselves back where we started, on the side of this quiet, lonely road. The sun is lower now, casting long shadows that stretch across the asphalt like dark fingers. But it's not the same place it was when we began this journey. An hour ago, this was just a stretch of road. Now, it's a stage. The trees are the silent witnesses. The wind in the leaves carries the whispers of a story that this place has held for nearly a century. A story of a bright life ended and a dark secret kept. We went looking for the truth of what happened to June Crab, and we found it. Not in the official reports, but in the memories passed down through generations, in the cold logic of the landscape, and in the glaring empty spaces within the official record. We pieced it together, from the crushed hat on the floorboard to the two graves resting on the same hill. That's the power of these forgotten corners of the world. The next time you drive past a crumbling stone chimney standing alone in a field, or see a forgotten cemetery being slowly reclaimed by the forest, remember this. They aren't just empty spaces. They are libraries filled with the stories of the people who came before us, stories of love, pride, and the terrible choices that can echo forever. The Ford coupe has long since turned to rust. The men who did this and the men who covered it up are nothing more than dust and names on a family tree. Everything from that terrible September afternoon is gone. The people are gone. The evidence is gone. But the story remains. On the 4th of May, 1903, Judge James B. Markham stood on the steps of the Breathitt County Courthouse. He was a man of the law, a symbol of order in a land that had forgotten the meaning of the word. A single shot echoed from a nearby window, sharp and final. The judge staggered back into his own courthouse and fell dead, a public execution designed to send a chilling message. In this corner of Kentucky, the only law that mattered came from the barrel of a gun. This was not an isolated act. It was a declaration of war in a place that had already earned its name. Bloody Breathitt. Was this a county of savages, or was it a place where honorable men were locked in a desperate battle for the very soul of the mountains? The truth, as always, is far more complicated and far more terrifying. Today, we trace the story of how power, greed, and an ancient code of honor turned a quiet county into a battlefield. To understand the blood that was spilled, you must first understand the ground that soaked it up. Late 19th century Breathitt County was a world unto itself, a labyrinth of fog-choked hollows and ancient hills that guarded its secrets fiercely. It was a place where the rhythms of life were dictated by the seasons, not by the clocks of a distant government. The people here were bound to the land and to each other by ties of blood and shared hardship. They were proud, self-reliant, and deeply suspicious of any authority that didn't carry their last name. The deepest scar on the soul of these mountains was the Civil War. Kentucky was a border state, a fractured land where loyalties were a personal and often fatal choice. In Breathitt, neighbor fought neighbor, and in some tragic cases, brother fought brother. When the official war ended, the fighting did not. Men returned home not to peace, but to simmering resentment. They brought their rifles with them, along with the grim knowledge that violence was a swift and effective way to settle a dispute. The old Union and Confederate grudges never truly died. They just became the fault lines for the family wars that would follow. This brutal history reinforced an older, unwritten law, the Code of the Mountains. In this isolated world, family was everything. It was your government, your army, and your only true safety net. An insult delivered to your cousin was an insult delivered to you, and it demanded an answer. Justice wasn't something you waited for a judge in a powdered wig to dispense. It was something you took yourself, often at the end of a path with a rifle in your hands. This wasn't seen as murder, it was seen as balancing the scales. This code was born of necessity. When your nearest neighbor is a mile away and the county seat is a day's hard ride, you learn to solve your own problems. A man's word was his bond, and his honor was his most valuable possession, worth more than his land, his livestock, or even his life. To have it challenged publicly was an unforgivable offense. It was this fierce, uncompromising sense of personal honor that would serve as the trigger for so much of the violence to come. Into this crucible of old wounds and rigid honor, a new element was introduced: progress, or what passed for it. Timber and coal barons from the north began to see the mountains not as a home, but as a treasure chest to be plundered. The railroad snaked its way into the hollows, bringing with it outside money, slick lawyers, and a lust for the region's vast natural wealth. Suddenly, control of the local courthouse wasn't just about settling local disputes. It was about controlling land deeds, mineral rights, and fortunes beyond imagination. This collision of worlds created the men who would fight the Breathitt County War. They were forged by the Civil War's lingering hatreds, governed by an ancient code of clan loyalty, and now tempted by a wave of new greed. They were men who believed their honor was worth dying for, and who were now being told that their entire world was for sale to the highest bidder. The storm was inevitable. Before the assassinations and the arrival of the state militia, there was a tense, fragile peace in Breathitt County. You have to imagine the town of Jackson in those days, a place of dusty streets and watchful eyes, where the future of the entire region was being decided not in an election booth, but in the quiet conversations held in hotel lobbies and general stores. It was a community living on a powder keg, but for a time, it was still a community. At the center of one world was Judge James "Jim" Hargis. To his enemies, he was a tyrant, a corrupt political boss who ruled with an iron fist. But to his supporters, and there were many, he was the patriarch of Breathitt County. The Hargis Hotel wasn't just a building, it was the capital of an unofficial kingdom. On any given day, you could find Jim Hargis there, holding court. A farmer might come to him to settle a land dispute. A young man might ask for a loan to start a family. Hargis was the law, the bank, and the government all rolled into one. He understood the mountain people because he was one of them. He provided a kind of stability, a predictable order. It was his order, to be sure, but in a chaotic world, that was something. He had built a dynasty of power, and he aimed to protect it and the people who lived under his influence. On the other side stood men like Judge James B. Markham and Ed Callahan. They represented a different vision for the mountains. Markham wasn't a patriarch, he was a lawyer. He believed in the power of books, of precedent, of a justice that was blind and applied equally to all men, regardless of their last name. He saw the Hargis machine as a cancer, a corrupting force that kept Breathitt County trapped in a cycle of poverty and violence. He fought his battles in the courtroom, armed with legal briefs and righteous indignation, seeking to dismantle the little Tsar's empire from within. Ed Callahan was the embodiment of that same fight, but he met it on the streets. He was a respected and fearless lawman, a man who believed his badge should mean something. Where Hargis commanded loyalty through favors and fear, Callahan earned respect through raw courage. He was the man who would walk into a saloon to disarm a drunkard when no one else dared, the man who would serve a warrant on a known killer. He and Markham were the face of the Reform Party, and they were fighting for a future where a man's success depended on his merits, not on his allegiance to a political boss. For a while, these two worlds coexisted. The Hargis men would walk on one side of the street, the Callahan men on the other. Business was conducted, families were raised, and life went on under a veneer of civility. But everyone knew the peace was hollow. These were not just two political factions, they were two fundamentally different futures vying for control of the same small patch of earth. One side was fighting to protect the world they had built, the other was fighting to build a new one. Both believed they were in the right. And in the mountains of Kentucky, when two sides both believe they are right, the result is almost always bloodshed. But peace is a fragile thing, and in every great tragedy, there is a crack in the armor of the men who stand at its center. For James Hargis, that flaw was a pride as old and unyielding as the mountains themselves. His control over Breathitt County was not a political office, it was his birthright. He had built his world through sheer force of will, and he could not tolerate the slightest challenge to his authority. To him, opposition was not a difference of opinion. It was a declaration of personal war. This wasn't the hot-headed pride of a young brawler. It was a cold, calculating force. They say that years earlier, a merchant in town had dared to publicly support one of Hargis's political rivals. Hargis didn't send men with guns. He did something far worse. He quietly passed the word. The man's credit was cut off at the bank. His suppliers suddenly had trouble filling his orders. Friends who had known him for 20 years would cross the street to avoid speaking to him. Within a year, the man was bankrupt and broken, forced to leave the county in shame. Jim Hargis didn't just defeat his enemies, he unmade them. This absolute refusal to share or cede power was his great strength, and it would become the engine of the coming war. The fatal flaw of the reformers, of men like Judge Markham and Ed Callahan, was the mirror image of Hargis's pride. It was a rigid, almost naive faith in the power of the law itself. They truly believed that the system, if followed correctly, was strong enough to protect them. They believed that a court order held more power than a Winchester rifle, and that a properly filed indictment could bring down a king. They saw the corruption of the Hargis machine and believed they could dismantle it piece by piece with the tools of their trade: legal arguments, witness testimony, and appeals to a higher authority. When the threats against them began, whispered in the street and delivered in unsigned notes, their response was to seek injunctions and write letters to the governor in Frankfurt. They trusted in a process that Jim Hargis had spent a lifetime learning how to manipulate and control from the inside. They were honorable men trying to play by the rules in a game where their opponent had already burned the rulebook. This faith in paper and ink, in a world that still answered to lead and steel, would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. And so the stage was set. On one side, a man whose pride would not allow him to bend. On the other, men whose principles would not allow them to break. It was a collision of two opposing kinds of stubbornness, two incompatible definitions of justice. In the suffocating quiet of the Kentucky mountains, there was no longer any room for compromise. A single spark was all that was needed to make the whole valley burn. The spark finally landed in 1902. It wasn't a public argument or a contested election. It was the sharp, ugly crack of a rifle in the dark. The target was James Cockrell, the town marshal of Jackson. But Cockrell was more than just a lawman. He was Jim Hargis's right hand. He was the muscle that backed up the little Tsar's quiet orders, the walking, breathing symbol of the Hargis machine's control over the streets. When Cockrell walked by, people understood who was in charge. His authority flowed directly from the rocking chair in the Hargis Hotel. One evening, he was cut down from ambush. It was a classic feud-style killing, a shot from the shadows, with no warning and no chance to fight back. In the code of the mountains, this was more than murder. It was an act of profound disrespect. It was a message, written in gunpowder and blood, sent directly to Jim Hargis. It said, "Your man is not safe. Your power is not absolute. Your walls can be breached." For a man like Jim Hargis, whose entire world was built on a foundation of unshakable authority, this was the ultimate insult. His pride, the very core of his being, had been publicly challenged in the most brutal way imaginable. This wasn't a legal matter to be sorted out by investigators and juries. This was a personal attack on his house, his name, and his honor. The gears of the official law were too slow, too uncertain. The only justice that mattered now was the swift, terrible justice of the clan. The Hargis faction didn't wait for proof. In their minds, there was only one group with the motive and the audacity to carry out such an act: the Callahan-Markham reformers. The accusation was made instantly and publicly. The word went out through the hollers and across the ridges. The opposition had crossed a line from which there could be no return. They had spilled first blood. That single shot changed everything. It tore away the thin veil of civility that had covered the county's tensions. The conflict was no longer about politics or legal maneuvering. It had become a blood feud. The time for filing motions in court was over. The time for filing coffins had begun. The cycle of vengeance, that terrible grinding engine of mountain warfare, had been switched on. And once it starts, it doesn't stop until it runs out of bodies to consume. In the days that followed James Cockrell's murder, a heavy silence fell over Breathitt County. It was the silence of a held breath, the kind of quiet that comes before a lightning strike. The elders of the community, men who still carried the scars of the Civil War, saw the signs. They had seen this kind of storm gather before. Preachers took to their pulpits, pleading for peace. Respected old men, who owed allegiance to neither faction, went as intermediaries, their hats in their hands, begging for calm and reason. They warned that this was a fire that, once lit, would consume the innocent along with the guilty. These warnings fell on deaf ears. They went to the Hargis Hotel and spoke to the little Tsar himself. Jim Hargis would listen to them patiently, his face a mask of cold granite. He would offer them a drink, thank them for their concern, and then show them the door. In his mind, their pleas for peace were an insult. How could there be peace when his man lay in the ground, struck down from the dark? To compromise now, to let the matter be handled by a slow and corruptible legal system, would be a show of weakness. It would be an admission that his power, his very authority over the county, could be challenged with impunity. His response was not to de-escalate, but to tighten his grip. Known gunmen and loyalists, men like Curtis Jett and Tom White, began to appear more frequently on the streets of Jackson, their presence a silent promise of retribution. On the other side, the same desperate pleas were made to Judge Markham and Ed Callahan. Friends and family begged them to be careful, to leave town for a while and let the situation cool down. A living dog is better than a dead lion, they were told. But their own unbending principles made this impossible. Judge Markham saw it as his sworn duty to uphold the law, especially when it was under attack. To flee would be to surrender the courthouse and the very idea of justice to the forces of intimidation. He believed with every fiber of his being that the shield of the law was strong enough to protect him. Ed Callahan, a lawman to his core, refused to be intimidated. He continued his patrols, served his warrants, and walked the streets of Jackson as if nothing had changed. He rejected the idea of surrounding himself with a heavy guard, arguing that a sheriff who had to hide behind a wall of rifles was no sheriff at all. They put their faith in the system. They wrote letters to the governor detailing the threats. They tried to empanel a grand jury. They fought back not with guns, but with affidavits and legal motions, believing that the truth written on paper would ultimately prevail over the lies whispered in the shadows. Every attempt at peace became just another step towards war. When neutral citizens tried to form a committee for public safety, both sides accused it of being a front for the other. When the governor sent a tepid message urging a peaceful resolution, it was seen as a sign of weakness from the state, emboldening the hardliners. The town of Jackson was no longer a community. It was two armed camps staring at each other across a dusty main street. The path of compromise had vanished, overgrown with pride on one side and principle on the other. Every man in Breathitt County had to choose a side, and everyone knew that the talking was over. The air in Jackson had grown so thick with hate you could taste it. The threats against Judge Markham were no longer whispers. They were shouted in the street. His friends stopped visiting after dark. Notes were left on his doorstep, crude and clear in their meaning. The world was closing in on him, and everyone knew a final terrible line was about to be crossed. This was the moment for one last off-ramp, one final chance to turn back from the abyss. That chance came, as it so often does, in the quiet of his own home. The story goes that on the night before he died, his wife came to him, her face pale with a fear that was beyond tears. She begged him, not as a political figure, but as her husband and the father of her children. "James, let us leave this place," she pleaded. "Let's go somewhere the names Hargis and Callahan mean nothing. What good is the law if it leaves your children without a father?" It was the clearest choice a man could face, his duty on one hand, his life and family on the other. It was a direct plea to the man, not the judge. For a long moment, Markham was silent. He was not a fool. He knew the danger was not just real, it was imminent. He could see the logic in his wife's plea, could picture a life of peace far away from the blood-soaked soil of Breathitt County. He could have packed a bag, taken his family, and been gone by sunrise. No one would have called him a coward. They would have called him a sensible man who chose to live. This was the crossroads. He could choose to be a husband and father, or he could choose to be a symbol. But the judge's faith in the law was as unbending as a rod of iron. He looked at his wife, and with a heavy heart, he made his decision. If a circuit judge can be run out of his own courthouse by threats, he told her, then there is no law in these mountains. There is only the rule of the gun. And if that is the case, then our children have no future here anyway. I will not run. He believed to his very soul that to back down would be to hand a final victory to the forces of anarchy. He had to believe the system he served was worth dying for. In that moment, he consciously rejected the path of peace and fully committed to his tragic course. He sealed his own fate not with anger or pride, but with a quiet, resolute sense of duty. The conversation was over. The last chance for a different outcome had passed. He would go to the courthouse in the morning, as he had every other morning. He would stand on those steps and face whatever came. He had made his choice. The morning of May the 4th, 1903, dawned like any other. The sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Jackson. Inside the Breathitt County Courthouse, the air was thick with the familiar smell of old paper and stale tobacco. Judge James B. Markham presided over his cases, his voice calm and steady, a small island of order in an ocean of simmering chaos. When the day's business was done, he walked out onto the front steps, pausing for a moment to speak with a friend, the tension of the courtroom momentarily behind him. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, a sound, sharp and violent, cracked the afternoon calm. It was not a firecracker. It was a single, deliberate report that echoed off the brick buildings and sent a flock of birds scattering into the sky. For a split second, there was only confusion. Judge Markham felt a tremendous, invisible force strike him in the chest, a blow so powerful it staggered him backward and stole the air from his lungs. He looked at his friend, a question in his eyes, his mind struggling to understand what had just happened. He looked down. On the crisp white fabric of his shirt, a dark stain was beginning to bloom, spreading like a fatal flower. The abstract threats, the whispered warnings, the pleas of his wife, it all became real in that single, horrific instant. The long, complex legal argument he had been making against the powers that ran Breathitt County was over. A final, brutal rebuttal had just been delivered from a window across the street. His instincts, the instincts of a man whose entire life revolved around that building, took over. He did not cry out. He did not fall to the ground. With the last of his strength, he turned and stumbled back through the courthouse doors. He was a man of the law, and in his final moments, he sought sanctuary in the house of the law. He made it a few feet into the main hall before his legs gave out. Judge James B. Markham collapsed onto the hard wooden floor, his life ending at the very heart of the institution he had died trying to defend. For a long moment, nobody moved. The echo of the shot faded, replaced by a silence that was heavier and more profound than any noise. The people on the street were frozen, their faces a mixture of shock and terror. They had just witnessed the unthinkable, the public execution of a circuit judge on the steps of his own courthouse. It was an act of such brazen contempt for the law that it felt like the end of the world. This was not just a murder, it was a coronation. It was a statement, clear and undeniable, about who truly held the power in bloody Breathitt. The assassins, identified as Curtis Jett and Tom White, were known Hargis men. And the message they sent was simple and terrifying. No one was safe. No office was high enough. No principle was strong enough to protect you. The little Tsar's reign was absolute, and the courthouse itself was no longer a symbol of justice, but a tombstone for the man who dared to believe in it. From the dusty window of the building across the street, Curtis Jett and Tom White watched their handiwork unfold. The sharp, acrid scent of spent gunpowder hung in the still air of the room, a smell of finality. They saw Judge Markham stagger, saw him disappear back into the courthouse he loved. There was no panic, no rush of adrenaline-fueled fear, only the cold, clean satisfaction of a job well done. They were soldiers who had just successfully completed a mission for their commanding officer. Their next move was a testament to their chilling confidence. They didn't scramble to escape into the mountains. They didn't have a fast horse waiting in a back alley. They simply broke down the rifle, wrapped it in a cloth, and walked down the back stairs. They emerged into the pandemonium of the street, not as panicked fugitives, but as silent observers. They melted into the very crowd that was gathering in horrified knots, their faces as blank and unreadable as any other bystander. They were hiding in plain sight, protected by a shield of terror so absolute that no one dared to even meet their gaze. In the hours that followed, a strange paralysis gripped the town of Jackson. The body of Judge Markham was carried from the courthouse. The local law enforcement made a great show of securing the scene, of asking questions they already knew the answers to. Everyone knew who had pulled the trigger. The motive was as plain as the hole in the judge's chest. But who would dare to make the arrest? The town's legal system had just been decapitated, and the message was clear. Any lawman who tried to bring in Jet and White would be the next one to lie on a cold slab. And so, the killers did not run. They didn't have to. Later that day, they were seen openly in a Jackson store buying tobacco. They walked the streets with a new kind of swagger, the swagger of men who had proven they were untouchable. They were not fugitives cowering in the woods. They were conquerors, and the town of Jackson was their occupied territory. Their freedom in those first hours and days was the ultimate demonstration of Jim Hargis's power. The law was dead, and its assassins were calmly walking over its grave. The end of the road had not come for them. It had come for the rule of law in Breathitt County. The bullet that struck down Judge Markham didn't stop in the courthouse hall. It traveled onward, a phantom projectile that tore through the fabric of his family. For his wife, the abstract fear she had voiced just the night before had become a brutal, life-altering reality. She was now a widow in a town ruled by her husband's killers. His children were now orphans, their name a mark of defiance that placed them in constant, unspoken danger. The very community they had lived in became a prison of watching eyes and silent whispers. Friends who once greeted them warmly now averted their gaze, not out of malice, but out of a primal fear of being associated with the losing side of a war. For the Reform faction, Markham's assassination was a catastrophic blow. He was their legal champion, the man who believed he could slay the dragon with a well-aimed lawsuit. His death was the brutal answer to that belief. It ripped the heart out of their movement, replacing their hope for a lawful victory with the cold, hard reality of terror. A cloud of fear, thick and suffocating as mountain fog, descended on his allies. Men who had spoken boldly of reform now fell silent. The choice they faced was stark and immediate. Flee Breathitt County, bend the knee to the little Tsar, or pick up a rifle and answer violence with violence. The murder's ripple effect spread through the entire community. The town of Jackson became a place of profound paranoia. Shutters were bolted earlier in the evening. The streets, once a place of commerce and conversation, grew quiet and empty after dusk. Business between factions ceased entirely. A man's last name became his uniform, and the simple act of walking down the street was a declaration of allegiance. The courthouse, once the center of civic life, was now viewed with dread, no longer a house of law, but a monument to a failed idea. The assassination didn't end the violence, it guaranteed its escalation. The scales of justice, or what passed for it in the mountains, were now grotesquely unbalanced. Such a public and high-profile killing demanded an answer. The cycle of vengeance now required a blood payment of its own, and the Callahan faction, robbed of their legal path, began to see the gun as their only remaining option. The murder of the judge directly led to the murders that followed, of the sitting sheriff, and then of his successor, Ed Callahan himself. The tragedy of Judge Markham's death was not just his own. The wreckage left behind wasn't just a grieving family and a dead lawman. It was a shattered community, a broken faith in the idea of civilization itself. Jim Hargis had not just eliminated a rival, he had murdered hope. And in its place, he had enthroned fear as the one true king of bloody Breathitt. The murder of a circuit judge was an act so audacious it could not be ignored, not even by the distant state government in Frankfurt. The carnage in Breathitt County had become a national embarrassment. In 1904, the governor declared the county to be in a state of insurrection and sent in the militia. This was not a small detachment of men. It was an invasion force. Hundreds of soldiers armed with modern rifles and Gatling guns arrived on the train, marching through the streets of Jackson with fixed bayonets. They were a foreign army, sent to impose a foreign law. Their primary mission was to ensure that Curtis Jett and Tom White could be tried without the jury being intimidated or the courthouse being burned to the ground. The trial became a spectacle. The courthouse was no longer a public building. It was a military fortress. There were soldiers on the roof, a guard with a bayonet at every door. The proceedings inside were a perfect illustration of the clash between two worlds. The prosecution came with law books, eyewitness testimony from terrified citizens, and the complex machinery of the state's legal system. And on the other side sat Jett and White. They did not carry themselves as common criminals racked with guilt. They sat with a quiet, defiant arrogance, like captured soldiers being tried by an enemy tribunal. In their minds, and in the minds of their supporters, they had broken no real law. They had acted according to the ancient mountain code, loyalty to their chief. They had eliminated a threat to their clan and its leader. Their defense was not one of innocence, but of justification. They were merely the instruments of a will greater than their own, soldiers in a war that the men in powdered wigs could never understand. Outside the courthouse walls, Breathitt County held its breath, deeply and bitterly divided. To the Hargis loyalists, Jett and White were martyrs, loyal men being sacrificed to appease the Flatlanders in Frankfurt. They were symbols of resistance against an outside force trying to change their way of life. To the friends of James Markham and the shattered Reform faction, they were simply assassins. The trial was the last, desperate hope that the rule of law might mean something after all, that a killer could be held to account, no matter who he worked for. After weeks of testimony that kept the entire nation spellbound, the jury, protected by a wall of state rifles, returned its verdict: guilty. Both Curtis Jett and Tom White were sentenced to life in prison. The newspapers declared it a victory for justice. But in the hollows of Breathitt County, the question lingered. Was it justice? The trigger men were going to prison, but the man who had almost certainly loaded the gun and given the order, the man whose power they were protecting, James Jim Hargis, was never even charged. The law had proven it could cage the wolves, but it seemed powerless to touch the man who owned the forest. With Jett and White behind bars, you might think justice had finally, imperfectly, triumphed. But the other side of the coin was still in play. James Jim Hargis, the little czar, the man at the center of the storm, remained. The state militia eventually packed up their Gatling guns and went home. The trials were over, and Jim Hargis was still the king of Breathitt County. For years, he walked the streets of Jackson, a living testament to a chilling truth. The law could punish the soldiers, but it couldn't touch the general. He had won. He had broken the reform movement, eliminated his chief rival, and survived the full might of the state's intervention. But the mountains have their own way of balancing the books. The justice that finally found Jim Hargis didn't come with a judge's order or from the rifle of a sworn enemy. It came from inside his own house, from his own blood. In February of 1908, 4 years after the Great Invasion, a bitter argument broke out between Hargis and his son, Beach. We don't know for certain what it was about: money, power, a personal slight. But it was a fire that could not be put out. The very culture of violence that Hargis had cultivated to maintain his power had taken root in his own family. On a cold winter day, on a public street in the town he ruled, the final act of the tragedy played out. Beach Hargis confronted his father, and the argument ended the only way such disputes seemed to end, in bloody breath-it. He pulled a gun and shot his father dead. The man who had orchestrated assassinations from the shadows, who had treated the county as his personal chessboard, was brought down not by the law or his political enemies, but by a simple, brutal family quarrel. There's a terrible poetic irony in his end. The state of Kentucky had failed to hold him accountable. The code of the mountains, which he had so expertly manipulated, was ultimately what destroyed him. He had lived by the sword of clan loyalty and died by the sword of a family feud. His death was not justice in the legal sense, but it was a grim and fitting final chapter for a man whose greatest legacy was the violence he left behind. With the little Tsar in his grave, put there by his own son, a strange and unfamiliar quiet settled over Breathitt County. The empire Jim Hargis had built through a lifetime of cunning and intimidation crumbled like a house of sand. There was no one to inherit his throne. The machine he had created was powered by his will alone, and without him, it ground to a halt. The name Hargis, once a word of power, became a whisper of shame, a cautionary tale of a man who ruled a kingdom and lost his own family. His descendants scattered, many leaving the county to escape the long, dark shadow of their name. On the other side of the ledger, the name Markham became something else entirely. It became a symbol of a lost cause, a ghost of what might have been. Judge Markham's family, seeking the peace he could not find for them in Jackson, eventually left the mountains. But they left his name behind, etched into the memory of the place. To this day, it stands for an honorable, if tragic, idea that the law should be something more than the will of the strongest man. But for the common folk of Breathitt, the years after were not about legacies. They were about survival. A profound and deliberate silence fell over the history of the feuds. It was a collective act of forgetting, a necessary amnesia. Fathers stopped telling their sons the stories. The names of the dead were still on the tombstones, but the reasons they were there were buried deep. To speak of the war was to risk reopening wounds that had barely begun to scar over, to reignite embers of hatred that still glowed in the dark. The community healed itself by cauterizing its own memory, choosing a future of silence over a past of pain. And into this silence, a new kind of power moved in. With the old patriarchs dead or disgraced, the county was left rudderless. The timber and coal companies from the outside no longer had to negotiate with a powerful little Tsar. They could now deal with a fractured, exhausted populace and a pliable local government. The great fight for Breathitt's soul did not end with the feuds. It had only entered a new phase. The rifle was put away, and the lawyer's briefcase took its place. The land and its wealth, which had been fought over with blood, would now be claimed with ink. The men who fought the Breathitt County War are long gone. Their rifles have turned to rust, their bodies to dust. But their story has not disappeared. It has seeped into the soil of the county itself, a permanent part of the landscape. And the most enduring echo of that bloody time is the name it earned, Bloody Breathitt. For more than a century, the people of this place have lived with that nickname. It clings to them like morning fog in the hollows, a ghost of a reputation they can never fully shake, a constant reminder of the time when their home was a battlefield. If you walk the streets of Jackson today, you can still touch the past. The old courthouse still stands, as to the murder that defined an era. And a persistent local legend says that the judge never truly left. On quiet nights, when the building is dark and empty, some people claim you can hear the faint sound of a man's footsteps, pacing the hall where Judge Markham fell. It's the ghost of a man who died for the law, still restlessly seeking the justice that was denied to him in life. Not far from there, in a quiet cemetery, you can find the weathered tombstones of Markham, of Hargis, of Callahan, their names worn by 100 years of rain and wind, the silent epilogue to a violent history. The story of the feuds is rarely found in official history books. It lives on in the way mountain people preserve their past, in stories told on a front porch, in hushed tones from one generation to the next. It has become a cautionary tale, a lesson taught to the young about the terrible price of pride and the destructive power of vengeance. The specific details may blur, the names may fade, but the core of the story remains. A warning about the darkness that can be unleashed when good men do nothing and powerful men do as they please. The spirits of the two main antagonists still haunt the county in their own ways. The ghost of Judge Markham is a sad one, a symbol of principle and sacrifice. But the ghost of Jim Hargis is something else entirely. It is the ghost of absolute power, of a time when one man's will could override all law and morality. He represents the old, untamed spirit of the mountains, both its strength and its terrifying brutality. Though the man is gone, his shadow, the memory of that kind of power, lingers as a reminder of what this place once was. So we come to the end of the trail and return to the question that started it all. Was this a land of savages or a place of honorable men locked in a desperate struggle? The truth is, it was both. There were no simple heroes or villains in the story of Bloody Breathitt. There were only men, forged by their time and place, and trapped by the very codes that gave them their strength. Jim Hargis was not a monster. He was a king from an older, fiercer world, a mountain patriarch who ruled by a law of loyalty and fear, and who defended his kingdom with savage brutality when it was threatened. And Judge James Markham was not a naive fool. He was a prophet of a new order, a man who believed that the rule of law could tame the wilderness and bring a just peace to the mountains. His tragedy was that he was a man ahead of his time who fatally underestimated the violence with which the old world would resist its own death. They were two titans of two different ages, standing on the same small piece of earth, and there was simply not enough room for both of them. In the end, this is not just a story about a feud. It is the story of a painful, bloody transition. It's the story of what happens when the unwritten law of the mountains, a code of honor, clan, and vengeance, collides with the written law of the state. The gunshots that echoed through the hollows were the death rattle of an entire way of life, a brutal response to the encroaching forces of industry, money, and a government that the mountain people had never trusted. The blood that soaked the courthouse steps was the terrible price of that change. And that, my friends, is the Ballad of Bloody Breathitt. It is a grim and lasting reminder that a man's greatest strength can become his most profound weakness, and that when the old ways of a place are forced to die, they seldom die quietly. Out here, deep in a West Virginia holler, where the road turns to gravel and the fog clings to the hillsides, the modern world gets quiet. You can find places like this all over the mountains. A forgotten family cemetery, nearly swallowed by ivy and time. These aren't grand monuments. They're simple weathered stones, leaning like old men tired of telling the same story. But it's the names and the dates etched upon them that pull you in. Earl Gibson died 1921. Silas Blackwood died 1923. These men didn't die in the mines. They didn't fall to the fever that swept through these camps so often. They shared one thing, and one thing only. A wife. A woman named Zoe Wilkins. To the law that condemned her, she was a monster. To her few defenders, she was just the unluckiest woman in the state. But to everyone else, she had a different name, the Black Widow of Appalachia. Today, we stand among these silent stones to listen to their whispers and piece together a story this land has tried its best to forget. Let's wind the clock back 100 years. The air here wasn't clean and silent then. It was thick with the grit of coal dust, a fine black powder that settled on windowsills, in your lungs, and in the lines of every face. This hollow was alive with the rumble of coal cars on the tracks and the distant rhythmic clang of pickaxes against the mountain's bones. Life was dictated by the shriek of the company whistle, a sound that sent men like Earl Gibson into the dark belly of the earth before sunrise, and a sound that wives like Zeo Zoe prayed to hear again at the end of the day. Earl was a young man, strong and full of the quiet hope that marks so many who work a dangerous trade. He believed his back was broad enough to carve out a decent life for him and his new wife. He'd come home each evening, his face caked in black, and wash up in a basin on the porch of their small two-room cabin. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, a tiny speck of warmth against the vast, indifferent mountains. Zeo Zoe was different from the other miners' wives. While they gathered on their porches to trade gossip and remedies, she often kept to herself. She wasn't unfriendly, just reserved. She had a sharp mind and a gaze that seemed to take in everything, a calm that felt out of place in a world built on noise and struggle. Some saw it as dignity. Others, even then, whispered it was a kind of coldness, an ambition that didn't belong in a simple coal camp. Their life together was a routine of small things, a shared meal of beans and cornbread by the fire, Earl talking about his dream of one day saving enough to buy a small piece of land away from the company store and its endless cycle of debt. Zeo Zoe would listen, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight, her thoughts her own. To anyone looking in, they were just another young couple trying to survive in a place that didn't make survival easy. But in these mountains, death was a constant neighbor. It came suddenly in the form of a rockfall or a gas explosion in the mine. It came slowly in the wheezing cough of black lung, and it came violently in the gut-wrenching sickness they called the flux, a plague that could sweep through a camp and fill a graveyard in a matter of weeks. A doctor was a luxury, and a sudden death was a tragedy, but it was a familiar one. It was a world that had grown used to the sight of fresh-dug graves, a fact that would soon prove very convenient for someone. The stories buried in the ground are one thing. The stories buried in paper and ink are another. In a county courthouse basement, tucked away in a dusty archive box, you can find the documents that give a voice to those silent gravestones. It's amazing what survives. This here is a copy of a page from the local paper, dated 1921. It's brittle and yellow, the words printed in the stark, formal language of the time. It's a short column nestled between an advertisement for livestock feed and a notice about a church social. It's the obituary for Earl Gibson. It's barely a paragraph long, and it reads just like 100 others from that era. It says he was a fine, hard-working man, taken too soon by a sudden and severe gastric illness, a stomach flux. The kind of thing that could kill a man in 3 days and have the neighbors nodding in sympathy, murmuring about bad water or tainted food. On the surface, it's just another sad, common story. A young wife left all alone. The community pitied her. But it's another piece of paper from that same box that changes the tone completely. This one is a life insurance claim, filed by Zeo Zoe Gibson, just days after her husband was in the ground. It wasn't a huge amount of money, not by today's standards. But in 1921, to a miner's widow with no other prospects, it was a small fortune. It was enough to buy a little plot of land, enough to be free from the company store, enough to breathe for the first time in her life without the weight of debt and dependency. This document right here, this isn't just an insurance policy, it's the first clue. It raises the question that no one dared to ask out loud back then. Was this just a fortunate coincidence in the midst of tragedy? Or was this the moment Zeo Zoe Wilkins realized that a husband's life had a value, but his death had a price? That insurance money from Earl's death changed things, not in a loud way, but in a way the whole holler could feel. Zoe didn't pack up and leave. She didn't waste the money on frivolous things. She bought a small plot of land, a little house just outside the direct control of the mining company. For the first time, she was a woman who owned something, a woman who answered to no one. And you have to understand, in a place where the company owned the houses, the store, and a man's very soul until his debt was paid, that kind of independence was as strange and unsettling as a summer snow. At first, the whispers were sympathetic. Good for her, some would say, making the best of a bad situation. But pity in a small town has a short shelf life, especially when the object of that pity seems to be doing just fine. Zoe's grief didn't look like the grief they were used to. It wasn't loud and public. It was a quiet, private thing. She held her head high. She managed her own affairs. And soon, the whispers began to change their tune. She didn't grieve long. They'd murmur over a fence post. Seems that money dried her tears right up. It was then that Silas Blackwood entered the picture. Silas was a mine foreman, older than Zoe, a man with a bit of authority, and more importantly, a healthy savings account. He was a widower himself, known to enjoy his drink, a man whose loneliness was as plain to see as the coal dust on his boots. He saw in Zoe a beautiful, quiet woman, a fine wife to run his home and ease his later years. He was flattered by her attention. And Zoe, well, she saw something in him too. She saw security. She saw a bigger house, more money, another step up and away from the life she was born into. That first insurance policy had been a revelation. It had shown her a way out of the grime and the poverty, a path paved not with a lifetime of back-breaking labor, but with a simple signature on a piece of paper and a well-timed tragedy. Her courtship with Silas Blackwood wasn't a romance. It was a business transaction, and the whole community was watching. They saw the older man, charmed and foolish. They saw the young widow, her eyes not on the man, but on what the man had. The seeds of conflict weren't just being sown in that little house. They were being planted in the minds of every neighbor who watched her, every gossip at the company store. They were just waiting for a reason for their suspicions to take root, and Zoe was about to give them one. History isn't just found in archives. Sometimes it's sitting on a front porch in a rocking chair, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Down a winding road, I found Elmore Vance. He's an old man now, with hands as gnarled as oak roots and eyes that have seen nearly a century of these mountains. He is the great-nephew of Silas Blackwood, and his grandfather was the man who first tried to sound the alarm. For his family, the story of Zoe Wilkins isn't a folk tale. It's a wound that has never fully healed. He doesn't call her the Black Widow. In the Vance family, she has always been that Wilkins woman. He speaks in a slow, deliberate cadence, the way men do when they're recalling a story they've heard 1,000 times, a story that's become a part of their own blood. My granddaddy, Jasper, he begins, he liked Silas, but he never trusted her, not for a minute. He said she had still eyes, like a snake on a rock, watching but never blinking. According to the story passed down to Elmore, the trouble came to a head just 6 months after the wedding. Silas, puffed up with pride and eager to show what a good provider he was, told his brother Jasper that he'd taken out a brand new, sizable life insurance policy. "Just to make sure my Zio is looked after if anything happens to me," he'd said with a grin. Elmore leans forward in his chair. Granddaddy said when he heard those words, a cold spot formed right in his gut. It was the same story, all over again. Jasper went to Silas that very evening and begged him to see reason. He didn't accuse Zoe directly, not at first. He just pleaded with his brother's common sense. "A woman who profits from one husband's grave is just unlucky," Elmore recounts his granddaddy saying. "But a woman who stands to profit from a second, that ain't luck, Silas. That's a plan." But Silas was blinded by his new bride. He got angry, accused his brother of jealousy, and told him to get out of his house and mind his own business. That argument, on the porch of a cabin that no longer stands, was more than just a family squabble. It was a line drawn in the dirt. Jasper Vance had made himself a problem. He had spoken the suspicion that everyone else was only whispering, and in doing so, he had put himself directly in the path of that Wilkins woman. The point of no return had been crossed, not just for Silas, but for his brother too. The argument didn't happen in whispers. It was a confrontation, born of desperation. Following his grim conversation with Silas, Jasper Vance couldn't let it rest. He walked over to his brother's cabin that very evening. The lamp was lit inside, casting a warm, deceptive glow. Zoe herself sat in a rocking chair by the hearth, darning one of Silas' work socks. She moved with a quiet efficiency, a picture of domestic peace. Jasper stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Silas," he said, his voice low and urgent, "we need to talk. That new insurance policy, it don't sit right with me." Silas, who had been enjoying the quiet evening, stiffened. He looked from his brother's worried face to his wife, who hadn't even looked up from her sewing. "Now, Jasper, we've been over this." "No, we ain't," Jasper insisted, stepping inside. "Earl Gibson took sick not long after she insured him. Now you do the same, and for twice the money. You're a fool if you don't see the pattern." The accusation hung in the small room, thick and ugly. Zoe's needle stopped its steady rhythm. For a single charged moment, the cabin was utterly silent. Silas's face flushed with anger. It was one thing for the town to whisper, but for his own brother to say it, in his own home, in front of his wife, it was an unbearable insult. "You'll not come into my house and call my wife a ghoul," he roared, getting to his feet. "She's a good woman. She's nursed me when I was sick. She's kept this house better than anyone. You're just jealous." "Jealous of what, Silas? Your own funeral?" Jasper shot back. "That was the final straw." "Get out," Silas snarled, pointing a trembling finger at the door. "Get out of my home, and don't you come back till you're ready to apologize to her." Jasper looked at his brother, his face a mask of sorrow and frustration. Then his eyes met Zoe's across the room. For the first time, she looked directly at him. There was no anger in her eyes, no fear. There was nothing at all. It was a calm, calculating stillness, the look of a woman who had just identified a problem and was already working on the solution. As Jasper backed out into the cold night air, he knew he hadn't just lost a brother. He had made a mortal enemy. The cabin door closed, shutting out not just a brother, but Silas Blackwood's last chance at salvation. You have to push your way through a thicket of rhododendron and climb over a fallen oak to find it now. If you didn't know what you were looking for, you'd walk right past it. But it's here. A collapsed square of foundation stones covered in a thick carpet of moss, and in the center, a jumbled pile of rock and soot-stained clay. This is all that's left of the chimney, once the warm, beating heart of the home where Silas Blackwood lived with his new wife. This isn't a place marked by the scars of a single violent act. There are no bullet holes in these stones. The horror that unfolded here was quiet, patient, and domestic. It was hidden in the everyday. Over there, nearly choked with a century of dead leaves, is the stone-lined well. This is where Zoe would have drawn the water for Silas' morning coffee, for the soup she simmered on the stove, for the cool drink he'd ask for when the first feverish thirst began to burn in his throat. Right here. This is where it happened. Not with the roar of a gunshot, but with the scrape of a spoon against the bottom of a bowl. The act of murder wasn't a moment of rage. It was a daily chore, a patient administering of poison disguised as an act of love. Within these stone foundations, Silas Blackwood wasted away, believing he was being cared for by a devoted wife, never realizing that the hands that soothed his brow were the same hands that were slowly, methodically killing him. The air is still and peaceful now, but this ground remembers the silence that followed the arguments and the terrible sickness that began soon after. It began, as Jasper Vance had feared, just a few weeks after their argument. Silas Blackwood started complaining of a fire in his belly. At first, he dismissed it as a bad batch of moonshine, a common ailment for him. Zoe was the very picture of a concerned wife. She brewed him herbal teas and insisted he stay home from the mines to rest. But the rest didn't help. The fire in his gut turned into a vice, twisting and cramping until the strong foreman was doubled over in his chair. Then came the sickness, a violent, unending wave of it that left him weak and trembling. He craved water, a burning, desperate thirst that no amount of liquid could quench. And through it all, Zoe was a constant presence. She was always there with a cool cloth for his forehead and a bowl of thin broth. "Just a little something to keep your strength up," she would murmur, spooning the warm liquid into his mouth. To any neighbor who stopped by to check on the ailing man, she was a saint. They saw her tending to him day and night, her face etched with worry. They didn't see the tiny pinch of white powder she stirred into the soup when no one was looking. The days bled into weeks. Silas, once a stout and hearty man, began to shrink. His skin grew pale and loose, his eyes sunk deep into their sockets. He became a ghost in his own home, too weak to leave his bed. The company doctor came once, a rushed visit between a broken leg at the mine and a birthing up the creek. He took one look at the withered man in the bed, listened to Zoe's calm description of the symptoms, and nodded grimly. "It's the stomach flux, and a bad case of it," he declared. "Keep him comfortable. That's all you can do." One evening, after Silas had been bedridden for nearly a month, his brother Jasper came to the house again, swallowing his pride. He couldn't bear the thought of his brother dying without making peace. He found Silas barely conscious, his breathing shallow. Zoe sat by the bed, her hands folded in her lap. Jasper looked at the shell of his brother, then at her calm, serene face, and the awful truth settled in his heart like a stone. He left without a word, the image of that quiet, patient woman seared into his memory. The rocking chair in the corner of the room swayed gently in the draught from the door, empty, but for the shawl left draped over its back. Silas Blackwood's struggle ended 2 nights later, in the dark, silent heart of the Appalachian night. After a man dies, his story is told in whispers. But the version that lasts, the one that gets filed away, is told in ink. This is the death certificate for Silas Blackwood, filed in the county clerk's office. It's a simple bureaucratic ledger. Name, date of birth, date of death. And under the heading Cause of Death, the doctor wrote 2 words: acute gastritis. It's so clean, so medical. A neat and tidy explanation that fits perfectly in a little box on a form. But acute gastritis doesn't capture the truth of it. It doesn't describe a man wasting away for weeks, his body racked with a fire that no water could put out. It doesn't mention the insurance policy that had just been signed, or the brother who was shouting warnings that nobody listened to. The official record sanitizes the horror, boiling a slow, agonizing death down to a stomachache. But then, you find another file. This one isn't from the doctor, it's from the insurance company. And insurance men, they have a different kind of curiosity. They deal in patterns and probabilities. The report, written by a claims investigator, is just as dry, but it asks a pointed question. He notes, "This is the second claim filed by Mrs. Wilkins in 3 years, both following the sudden gastric death of a husband. Further inquiry is recommended." Those 2 words, further inquiry, were the spark that lit the fuse. That recommendation led to this: the exhumation order from the circuit court judge. Look at the formal, looping script. It gives law enforcement the authority to go to the quiet churchyard cemetery and disturb a fresh grave. This piece of paper took the whispers of the holler and turned them into the cold, hard action of the law. The official record started with a lie, but it ended with an order to dig up the truth. That exhumation order was not a quiet affair. The news spread through the hollers like a brush fire. On the day the sheriff and his deputies arrived at the cemetery with shovels, a crowd gathered at a respectful distance, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and dread. The sound of digging was the only noise that broke the silence. When the caskets of both Earl Gibson and Silas Blackwood were opened, a collective gasp went through the onlookers. The bodies were in an unnervingly well-preserved state, a telltale sign of the preserving qualities of arsenic. The whispers now had physical proof. The truth wasn't just buried 6 feet deep, it was pickled in poison. The day the law came for Zoe Wilkins, there was no dramatic chase through the mountains. Sheriff Miller and a deputy simply rode their horses up to her little house. She was on the porch, rocking in her chair, as if she were expecting them. They say she didn't flinch when the sheriff showed her the warrant for her arrest. She didn't cry or protest her innocence. She simply stood up, smoothed the front of her black dress, went inside to fetch her bonnet, and walked with them as calmly as if she were heading to the Sunday service. Her silence was more damning than any confession. The trial was a mountain spectacle. The courthouse was packed to the rafters every single day, the air thick with the smell of sweat, dust, and cheap tobacco. Miners took days off from the coalface. Farmers left their fields, all to cram into the sweltering room and get a look at the woman they were now calling the Mountain Borgia. It wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning. This was the community's chance to finally pass judgment on the woman who had unsettled them for so long. The prosecutor, a fire and brimstone preacher in a lawyer's suit, built his case brick by damning brick. He laid out the pattern of death and the pattern of profit, showing the jury how each untimely death had made Zoe a richer woman. His star witness was the town pharmacist, a nervous little man named Abernathy, who, under oath, pointed a trembling finger directly at the defendant. "That's her," he squeaked. "She's the one who kept buying rough-on-rats poison, said she had a terrible infestation, bought enough to kill every rat in the county." Her defense lawyer fought back, painting a picture of a poor, misunderstood widow being persecuted by superstitious neighbors. He argued that dysentery was common, that arsenic was used in every farmhouse, that this was nothing more than a witch hunt fueled by gossip and jealousy. But his arguments were undone by his own client. Zoe sat through the entire proceeding as still as a stone effigy. When the prosecutor finally turned to her and thundered, "Did you feed these men poison for their insurance money, Mrs. Wilkins?" She looked at him with those unblinking eyes and said, in a voice no louder than a rustling leaf, "No, sir, I did not." She showed no fear, no anger, no grief, nothing. That chilling calm was all the jury needed to see. They were out for less than 2 hours. When they filed back in, their faces were set like stone. The foreman didn't even look at her as he delivered the verdict. Guilty. The judge, his voice ringing with condemnation, called her actions a cold-blooded stain upon the soul of this state and sentenced her to spend the rest of her natural life in the state penitentiary. The law's pursuit was over. The official record was now written, and Zoe Wilkins's name was forever etched into the annals of Appalachian crime. We're back where we started, in this quiet little cemetery tucked into the side of the mountain. Here are the stones for Earl Gibson and Silas Blackwood. They're weathered, but you can see that someone still tends to them. The weeds are pulled back, and a small faded plastic flower sits in the dirt in front of Silas's marker. Their names are still here, etched in stone, a permanent testament to the lives they lived, however short. They remain a part of this land, buried in the soil they called home, remembered by family. But to find Zoe Wilkins's final resting place, you have to travel hundreds of miles away, to the grounds of the old state penitentiary. There's a field there, behind the high stone walls. It's not a family plot. It's a place of grim uniformity, a grid of simple, numbered markers for the inmates who lived and died in the state's care. There are no loving epitaphs, no flowers, no family names. It's a place scrubbed clean of personal history. And under one of those anonymous markers lies the woman who caused so much turmoil. There is the final biting irony of her story. The woman who craved land, money, and independence, who killed to possess the property of other men, ended her days with nothing to her name. Her final home is a numbered plot of earth owned by the very state that locked her away. Her victims, the poor miners she looked down on, lie here in the free mountain air, their names known. Her name, the one that once struck fear into a whole community, is nowhere to be found. Looking at these disparate graves, the remembered and the forgotten, you realize the verdict wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of the final chapter. For the families left behind, and for Zeo Zoe herself, the sentence was the start of a long, slow aftermath, a shadow that would stretch on for decades. After the gavel fell and the cell door clanged shut, a different kind of quiet settled over the hollow. The excitement of the trial bled away, leaving behind the awkward silence of a community that had just consumed one of its own. For a time, life tried to return to normal. The company whistle blew, the men went back into the mines, and the women went back to their chores. But a scar had been left. Doors were locked a little tighter at night, and a neighbor's sudden sickness was met with a flicker of suspicion that hadn't been there before. For Jasper Vance, the verdict was not a victory. The justice he had fought so hard for tasted like ash in his mouth. It didn't bring his brother back. It didn't erase the memory of Silas wasting away in that bed, or the image of Zeo Zoe's cold, placid face in the courtroom. He had been right, but being right had brought him no peace. He lived out his years a quieter, more somber man, forever marked by the knowledge of what one human being was capable of doing to another, hidden behind a placid smile and a bowl of soup. Meanwhile, Zeo Zoe Wilkins traded the green, open mountains for a world of grey stone and iron bars. Her reputation preceded her, and the other inmates at the penitentiary gave her a wide berth. They watched the infamous Black Widow, expecting to see a monster. Instead, they saw a quiet, reserved woman who did her work in the prison laundry without complaint, who read books from the meager library, and who never, ever spoke of her past. Her chilling composure, which had condemned her in court, now served as a kind of armor. She was an enigma within the walls, just as she had been in the hollow. The years ground on, turning the ink on the court records from black to brown. Zeo Zoe's dark hair turned to grey. Her youth and beauty faded under the harsh prison lights, but her story didn't. She never filed an appeal. She never sought a pardon. And to the parole boards that met with her every few years, she gave the same calm, unwavering answer she gave in the courtroom. I did not do it. Her silence became her final legacy, a wall of denial that would stand until the day she died. An old woman in a prison infirmary, taking her secrets, whatever they were, with her to a numbered grave. You'd think a guilty verdict and a life sentence would be the end of it. The case closed, the story finished. But in the mountains, stories have a way of living on, of changing shape in the telling. And the story of Zeo Zoe Wilkins is no exception. To this day, the truth of what happened in that little cabin remains a point of contention, a ghost that haunts the family lines. For the descendants of the Vance family, and for most people who know the tale, the book is closed. Zeo Zoe Wilkins was a monster hiding in plain sight, a mountain Medea who saw her husbands not as partners, but as assets to be liquidated. They point to the pattern, the insurance money, the pharmacist's testimony, and her chilling lack of emotion in the courtroom. To them, it's an open and shut case, a clear story of greed dressed in a black mourning gown. But Zeo Zoe never confessed. And that single stubborn fact, her lifelong insistence on her own innocence, has been just enough to keep a flicker of doubt alive for 100 years. You can still find a few old-timers, a few contrarians, who will offer up the other side. They'll ask you, was she a killer? Or was she just a woman who refused to play the part of the helpless, weeping widow? In an age when women were expected to be emotional and dependent, Zeo Zoe was quiet, intelligent, and handled her own finances. Was she condemned for murder, or was she condemned for being different? They'll point out that the evidence was purely circumstantial. No one ever saw her put poison in the soup. They saw a woman buy rat poison, a common household item, and they saw men die of a common stomach ailment, and they drew a straight, deadly line between the two. Perhaps, they argue, she was just the victim of a mountain witch hunt, a woman destroyed by gossip and the bad luck of being widowed twice. The truth? The absolute truth of what was in her heart probably died with her in that prison infirmary. All we're left with are the conflicting echoes, two stories that can't both be true, but that both refuse to die. Over the decades, the hard facts of the Zio Zoe Wilkins trial began to soften and warp, like old glass in a fire. Her story leached out of the courthouse records and seeped into the soil of the mountains themselves, where it grew into something else entirely, a full-blown Appalachian legend. The flesh-and-blood woman who bought rat poison at the general store was slowly replaced by a supernatural phantom, a creature of folklore. For generations, her name became a cautionary tale. Mothers would warn their sons, "You be careful of a pretty face with a quiet tongue. Remember Zio Zoe." She became the local boogeyman, a dark fable about the poison of greed. They stopped talking about arsenic and started whispering about a secret spring deep in the woods whose water was tainted by the devil himself, water she would collect in a blue glass bottle under a new moon. They swore that the roses she planted on her husband's graves always bloomed with withered black petals, as if the very ground rejected her feigned grief. And of course, there is the ghost story. Some say that on a moonless night, if you stand by the fallen chimney where her house once stood, you can sometimes see a faint light moving through the trees. They say it's the ghost of Zio Zoe, forever wandering the land she bought with blood, eternally searching for something she can never truly own. The real woman died in a state prison far from here. But the legend, the dark and terrifying story the mountains created to explain a horror they couldn't comprehend, that story never left. And so we find ourselves back where we began, standing in this quiet patch of ground among the leaning stones. It looks the same. The ivy still crawls over the fence line, and the wind still sighs through the pines. But it feels different now, doesn't it? These aren't just names on weathered rock anymore. They are Earl and Silas, men with hopes and fears, whose lives ended in a bowl of soup. We see the ghost of a small cabin over on that ridge, and we can almost feel the cold, calculating gaze of the woman who watched the world from its porch. We have followed this story from these graves to the dusty pages of the courthouse, from the faded memory of an old man on his porch to the grim reality of a prison ledger. We've seen how a real-life tragedy, born of desperation and greed, can curdle into a ghost story told to frighten children. It's a reminder that every forgotten foundation, every overgrown family plot you pass on a lonely road isn't just a ruin. It's a library, filled with stories of love, rage, and the terrible choices that can echo for a century. Was Zio Zoe Wilkins a cold-blooded monster or a misunderstood woman condemned by circumstance? The absolute truth of what was in her heart is likely buried with her in that anonymous grave. But in the end, it almost doesn't matter. The story she created, whether by her actions or by her silence, has become a part of this landscape, as permanent as the mountains themselves. The arsenic has long since turned to dust. The insurance money is gone. The people are all just memories, but the story remains. The pre-dawn light on August 12, 1967, was supposed to bring another quiet day to the backroads of McNairy County, Tennessee. But that morning, the silence wasn't broken by birdsong. It was shattered by the roar of a V8 engine and the deafening chatter of automatic weapons. A sheriff's car, torn apart by a hailstorm of bullets, swerved violently and crashed into a ditch. Inside, a giant of a man lay drowning in his own blood, his face a ruin. Beside him, his wife was gone forever. They said it was just another violent act in a lawless land. But the old-timers in these mountains knew the truth. This wasn't just a murder. It was the climax of a one-man war. Today, we're going to peel back the layers of legend and rumor to ask one simple question. How did a man sworn to uphold the law become the most feared beast in Tennessee? To understand the storm, you first have to understand the calm that came before it. McNairy County, Tennessee, in the early 1960s, was a land of rolling hills and quiet creeks, a place where life was supposed to move at the speed of the seasons. But on its southern edge, where Tennessee bled into Mississippi, there was a festering wound known as the state line. It was a world unto itself, a kingdom of rust bucket clubs and neon-lit sin, ruled by a brutal syndicate the locals called the Dixie Mafia. Here, the only laws that mattered were bribery and violence. It was to this world that Buford Pusser returned in 1962. He wasn't a hero or a crusader. He was just a giant of a man, 6'6", and built like a Tennessee oak tree, tired of the life he'd been leading. He'd been a Marine, and he'd wrestled professionally up in Chicago as Buford the Bull. But he was done with all that. All he wanted was to come home, to build a quiet life with his wife, Pauline, and their 2 small children. He was a family man, looking for peace. You can almost picture it. A simple house, the sound of his children's laughter in the yard, the comfort of Pauline's presence. This was the dream he had traded the roar of the wrestling crowd for. A life measured not in knockouts, but in sunrises over the Tennessee hills. He wasn't looking for trouble. He believed, or maybe just hoped, that if he left the darkness on the state line alone, it would leave him alone too. But that kind of darkness doesn't stay put. It seeps into everything. The Dixie Mafia wasn't just a collection of criminals, it was an occupying army. Their illegal casinos, brothels, and moonshine operations were an open secret, protected by a wall of fear and bought-off badges. They were a cancer, and decent folk knew you didn't poke a cancer. You just prayed it didn't spread to your house. Buford's own father, Carl Pusser, was the police chief in the small town of Adamsville. He was a man who wore a badge but knew its limitations. He'd watched the state line mob operate for years, a weary, powerless spectator to their reign. He warned his son, his words heavy with the wisdom of a man who knows what monsters lurk in the shadows. "Don't go down there, son," he'd say. "Those people are snakes. They'll kill you and not even blink an eye." Buford had come home seeking a sanctuary, but he had unknowingly planted his family's flag on the doorstep of a war zone. The quiet life he craved was an illusion, and it was only a matter of time before the illusion shattered. Peace, as it turns out, was a fragile thing, and it was shattered not by some grand crusade, but by a simple, grubby act of theft. One night, Buford and a friend made the mistake of stepping into the Lucky Spot, one of the notorious clubs on the state line. It was a place that smelled of stale beer and desperation, a spider's web disguised with cheap lights. Like so many men before him, Buford found himself in a card game that was less about luck and more about predatory skill. He was cheated, plain and simple. Now, a man like Buford Pusser, a man who had wrestled bulls and served his country, was not the kind to let that stand. He didn't shout, he didn't draw a gun. He just stood up to his full towering height and demanded his money back. It was a matter of pride. And in that den of vipers, pride was a fatal flaw. They didn't argue, they overwhelmed him. It was a flurry of fists and boots, the cold, sharp bite of a knife, and then nothing. They beat him, cut him, and left him for dead in a roadside ditch like a piece of trash. But Buford Pusser didn't die. He was found somehow and hauled to a hospital, a broken and stitched-together wreck of a man. And it was there, lying in that sterile white room, staring at the ceiling and feeling the fire of 100 different pains, that the decision was made. The quiet family man was buried in that ditch, along with his blood. Something else was clawing its way out. He knew the local law was bought and paid for. Complaining to them would be like complaining to the wolves that they'd eaten your sheep. No, this was personal. This was a debt that would be paid. This was the point of no return. In 1964, to the absolute shock of the corrupt establishment, The man they had left for dead put his name on the ballot for sheriff of McNairy County. He was only 26 years old, a political nobody. His campaign was brutally simple, a 4-word promise that was also a direct threat. "I will clean this county." It was a spark in a warehouse full of dry timber. The people who had lived in the shadow of the state line mob for a generation were tired of the fear, tired of the corruption. They saw in this giant of a man not a politician, but a reflection of their own silent rage. And so they did the unthinkable. They elected him. The war had been declared. The state line mob had had enough. The bribes hadn't worked. The threats had been ignored. The stray bullets and hidden bombs had all failed. Sheriff Buford Pusser was not a problem they could manage. He was a force of nature they had to destroy. And so they set a trap, simple and brutal, baiting it with a lie. The call came in before dawn on August the 12th, 1967. A report of a disturbance, a routine call-out on a lonely stretch of road. Buford grabbed his keys, but this time he wasn't going alone. His wife, Pauline, had a bad feeling. She always worried, and that morning her worry was a physical thing. She insisted on going with him. It was a habit born of love, a small act of solidarity that would place her directly in the path of the hurricane. They drove through the quiet, misty Tennessee morning, the conversation likely turning to their kids, to the simple plans of a day that would never come. And then, in the rearview mirror, a black Cadillac moving too fast, closing the distance with predatory intent. It pulled alongside them. For a heartbeat, there was just the hum of 2 engines racing down an empty road. Then the world came apart. The morning calm was ripped to shreds by a sound that didn't belong there, a mechanical, stuttering thunder that echoed off the pines. This wasn't a pistol shot. This was a declaration of total war. The sheriff's car, a heavy fortress of American steel, became as fragile as glass. The windows didn't break, they vaporized into a million glittering fragments. The metal body was punched through again and again, perforated by a force that tore through it like wet paper. Buford felt a sudden, violent impact from the seat beside him. The sound of Pauline's voice was just gone. A final sharp silence replaced it, a silence more deafening and more terrible than all the gunfire in the world. Then an explosion of white-hot agony erupted in his own face. It wasn't a sharp pain, it was a demolition. He tasted copper and shattered bone. The world tilted, spun into a blur of green and brown, and then went dark as the car, no longer under any command, swerved off the road and crashed into an embankment. Silence returned, thick and heavy, smelling of gunpowder, gasoline, and blood. When Buford Pusser regained consciousness, it was to a world of pure horror. He was pinned behind the steering wheel, his own jaw a hanging ruin. He could see his own reflection in a shard of the mirror, a monster's face staring back. But that wasn't the worst of it. He turned and saw his wife. She was slumped against the door, eerily still. The woman who had been the calm center of his chaotic life, the reason for his impossible fight, was gone. In that moment, lying in the wreckage, something inside him broke forever. And something else, something far harder and colder, was forged in its place. He wasn't thinking about survival. He was thinking about a testament. His hand, slick and shaking, fumbled for the radio microphone. He keyed it, and a sound that was barely human, a rasping, gurgling whisper, broke the police frequency. He named the names. He gave them his killers. He was sure it was his dying breath, and he used it not to ask for help, but to sign a death warrant. The first deputies to arrive at the scene found a slaughterhouse. The car was a metal sieve, the air thick with the coppery smell of blood. They found Pauline Pusser, gone from the world. And then they found the sheriff, a grotesque sculpture of flesh and bone, somehow, impossibly, still breathing. His rasped words over the radio hadn't been a ghost's farewell. They were the first shots of a new war. The ambush had failed in its ultimate goal. It hadn't killed Buford Pusser. It had made him immortal. What followed was a medical odyssey. Buford was rushed from hospital to hospital, a puzzle of a man that surgeons had to piece back together. It wasn't one operation or two or even 10. It took 18 separate surgeries to rebuild his face. His jaw was wired shut, his features held together by steel pins and medical ingenuity. For months, he lived in a world of muffled sounds and liquid food, his grief a silent, suffocating companion. The physical pain was immense, but it was nothing compared to the gaping wound left by Pauline's absence. The man who eventually walked out of that hospital was not the same man who had been carried in. The warmth in his eyes had been replaced by a cold, hard focus. The grief hadn't broken him. It had tempered him, like steel plunged into ice water. He was still the sheriff, he still wore the badge, but everyone in McNairy County understood that his mission was no longer about law and order, it was about retribution. The man they had called Buford the Bull was gone. In his place stood the Beast, and now the Beast was avenging his mate. News of the ambush swept through Appalachia like a firestorm. The brazen attack on an elected lawman and the murder of his wife was a line crossed even for the Dixie Mafia. It was an act of pure arrogance, a message that no one was safe. A massive manhunt was launched, fueled by Buford's dying accusations. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation got involved, and rewards were offered. The state line mob, for the first time, felt the heat of real, statewide scrutiny. They had poked the bear one too many times, and now the entire forest was coming for them. But the official investigation was just the public face of the hunt. The real story was being whispered in hushed tones in every diner and on every front porch in the county. People knew the system was slow, that lawyers could twist the truth. They also knew Buford Pusser. They knew his capacity for singular, relentless focus. The members of the state line mob knew it too. They had created a martyr, a widower with nothing left to lose. And as Sheriff Pusser pinned his badge back on his chest, his newly constructed face a grim mask, every soul in that lawless strip of land knew that the official manhunt was secondary. The real judgment was coming, and it wouldn't be delivered in a courtroom. Eventually, the wheels of state justice turned, and one of the men Buford Pusser had named from his pool of blood, a vicious enforcer named Carl Towhead White, was brought to trial. The McNairy County Courthouse had never seen anything like it. It wasn't a legal proceeding, it was a spectacle, a powder keg with a short fuse. The room was packed with armed deputies and wary onlookers, the air so thick with tension you could taste the fear. At the center of it all, a silent, imposing figure sat in the gallery. It was Buford, his face a permanent, ragged roadmap of the violence he'd endured, his eyes fixed on the man in the defendant's chair. Towhead White, for his part, seemed to enjoy the attention. Flanked by expensive lawyers from out of state, he was the picture of defiance. He didn't show a hint of remorse. Instead, he wore a smirk, a look of smug confidence that told the whole world he believed he was untouchable. He was a creature of the state line, and he trusted in the power of money and intimidation to bend the law to his will, just as it had always done before. The prosecution put up its best fight, with Sheriff Pusser as its star witness. He took the stand, his rebuilt jaw making every word a deliberate effort, and he told his story. He pointed his finger at Towhead White and named him as one of the architects of the ambush that killed his wife. It was powerful, raw testimony. But the defense lawyers were slick and merciless. They twisted his words, painting him not as a victim, but as a violent, out-of-control lawman on a personal vendetta, a man so consumed by rage he would blame anyone. Without a murder weapon, without other witnesses willing to talk, the case began to fray. It was his word, his pain, against a wall of silence. Then came the verdict. The foreman of the jury, a man who refused to make eye contact with anyone in the room, read the words that would echo through the Tennessee hills for decades to come. Not guilty. A wave of disbelief and anger washed over the crowd. Towhead White's smirk broadened into a triumphant grin. He had beaten the system. He was a free man. But as the deputies escorted him from the courtroom past the jeering crowds, Buford Pusser simply stood up. He didn't shout. He didn't make a threat. He just watched White walk away, his expression unreadable, a chilling calm that was far more terrifying than any outburst of rage. The law of men had spoken, and it had failed. The gavel had fallen, the case was closed. But everyone in that courthouse knew this was not the end. It was merely the end of the part of the story that would be written down in official records. Now, a different kind of justice was about to be served. The unwritten, unforgiving justice of the mountains. The verdict of not guilty was just a legal footnote. In the hollows and back roads of McNairy County, a different kind of verdict was being delivered. One by one, the specters from Buford Pusser's past began to disappear. Carl Towhead White, the man who smirked his way out of the courtroom, was found shot to death in a motel in Mississippi less than 2 years later. Kenny Kirksey, another suspect, was gunned down. Louise Hathcock, the defiant madam of the state line, died in a fiery crash when her car inexplicably flew off a bridge. Law enforcement called it mob business and tragic accidents. But the people of McNairy County called it Pusser's justice. No one could prove his hand in any of it, but in their hearts, they didn't need to. The beast, they whispered, was balancing the scales. This raw, brutal story couldn't be contained by the Tennessee state line. It broke free and became an American phenomenon. In 1973, the movie Walking Tall hit theaters, turning Buford Pusser from a local legend into a national folk hero. He was no longer just a small-town sheriff. He was the living embodiment of every decent person's rage against a system that seemed broken and corrupt. He was the man who fought back when everyone else was told to just keep their heads down. The traces of that war are not gone. They're still there, waiting for you in Adamsville, Tennessee. You can visit the Buford Pusser Home and Museum, the house he shared with Pauline, and see the life they were trying to build. You can stand in stunned silence before the actual car he was ambushed in, a mangled relic riddled with the bullet holes that changed his life forever. A few miles down the road, a granite monument stands on the quiet shoulder of the highway, marking the exact spot where Pauline died, a permanent scar on the landscape. For years, his daughter Dwana was the keeper of the flame, a tireless guardian of her father's legacy, ensuring that the world remembered the husband and father, not just the unstoppable force of vengeance. These aren't just historical artifacts. They are tangible pieces of a man's soul, physical proof of the price he paid. The newspapers have moved on, and most of the world has forgotten. But the mountains remember. The story of Buford Pusser is woven into the fabric of that place, a ghost that still walks tall along those dark country roads. So we come back to the question we asked at the very beginning. How did a man sworn to uphold the law become the most feared beast in Tennessee? The answer, my friends, is that he didn't become a beast. The beast was always there, sleeping inside a good man. It was woken up by a world that refused to play by any rules but its own. When the law proved to be a shield for the wicked and a lie to the innocent, Buford Pusser reached for an older, harsher code. He became the monster the monsters were afraid of, because they had left him no other choice. The story of Buford Pusser is more than just a tale of revenge. It's a brutal lesson, carved in scar tissue and written in blood, about what happens when good people are pushed too far. It is the quintessential Appalachian saga, a story of fierce independence, a deep distrust of corrupt authority, and the belief that sometimes justice isn't found in a law book, but at the end of a hickory stick. He endured unimaginable loss, but he never, ever backed down. He proved that one man, filled with enough righteous fury, could indeed stand against an army and make it blink. And in the end, maybe that's why his final chapter remains so unsettling. He survived the ambushes, the bullets, and the bombs, only to die in a single fiery crash on a lonely road, just a stone's throw from where he'd lost Pauline. The official report called it an accident, but in the hills of McNairy County, they know better. They believe the darkness he fought so hard finally found a way to snuff out his light with one last cowardly act. His death became the final, chilling piece of his legend, a mystery that will never be solved. He wasn't a perfect hero. He was a flawed and furious man who walked into hell and decided to kick the door down. Two days shy of her 41st birthday, shotgun blasts ripped through the quiet hills of the Indian Territory. She was shot in the back. A coward's ambush. The woman they called the Bandit Queen lay dead in the dirt, just feet from her own gate. The dime novels painted her as a female Jesse James, a ruthless outlaw. But that's the legend. How does a girl who mastered Greek and the piano, born to a respectable family, end her days this way? Today, we separate the truth from the lies to find the real Myra Maybelle Shirley and to ask the question that still haunts these hills. Who wanted her dead? Before the legend, there was a girl named Myra Maybelle Shirley. She wasn't born in a dusty outlaw camp, but into a life of relative comfort in Carthage, Missouri. Her father, John Shirley, was a respected farmer, innkeeper, and judge, a man of property and standing. Their home sat on the very edge of civilization, where the rolling prairies gave way to the rugged ancient Ozark Hills. It was a land with a soul much like Appalachia's, a place of tight-knit clans, fierce independence, and memories as long and deep as the valleys themselves. The roots of that spirit ran deep in Myra's blood. Her mother, Elizabeth Hatfield Shirley, came from the same line as the notorious Hatfields of the West Virginia-Kentucky border. This wasn't just a distant relation, it was a heritage. It meant that Myra was born into a world where honor was defended with fists and firearms, where loyalty to family was the highest law, and where an insult was a debt that would one day be paid in full. This was the unwritten code of the mountains, a code she understood long before she ever read a law book. On the surface, however, Myra was being molded into a proper Southern lady. Her father sent her to the Carthage Female Academy, a place of refinement and learning. She studied the classics, mastered Greek and Latin, and could fill the Shirley home with the beautiful, complex notes of a piano sonata. She was intelligent, articulate, and poised, everything a daughter of a prominent family was expected to be. She was destined for a life of quiet dignity, of ball gowns and polite conversation. But beneath the corset and silk beat the heart of a rebel. The same girl who could quote Greek philosophers was more at home in the saddle, racing her horse through the woods with a freedom most women of her time could only dream of. She preferred the company of her older brother, Bud, and his friends, learning from them the ways of the wilderness. She could handle a shotgun with a skill that shamed grown men and knew the hidden trails of the Ozarks as if they were lines on the palm of her hand. Two worlds were at war inside this young woman: the polished, respectable world her father was building for her, and the wild, untamed world of the hills that flowed in her Hatfield blood. For a time, she could walk in both. But a storm was gathering on the horizon of America, a storm of fire and steel that would sweep across the nation, and it would force Myra Maybelle Shirley to choose, once and for all, which world she truly belonged to. Little did she know that choice would burn the life she knew to the ground. If the Ozark Hills were the anvil of Myra's character, the Civil War was the hammer that shattered it and reforged it into something hard and sharp. When the war came, it didn't just divide the nation, it ripped through Missouri, turning neighbor against neighbor in a savage guerrilla conflict. The Shirley family didn't hesitate. Their loyalty was to the Confederacy, and their home soon became a clandestine way station for the most feared Southern partisans, the bushwhackers. Men like William Quantrill and Bloody Bill Anderson, men who fought with a cold fury, found refuge under the Shirley roof. And riding with them were boys who would become legends in their own right, the James brothers and the younger brothers. This was the world that consumed Myra Maybell. She saw these men not as outlaws, but as heroes defending their homes. And her greatest hero was her own brother, Edwin, whom everyone called Bud. He was everything she admired, brave, defiant, and free. When he joined the bushwhackers, Myra's war began. The polite young lady from the academy vanished, replaced by a cunning operative for the Southern cause. Legends say she would use her charm and education to flirt with Union officers, prying information from them about troop movements, which she would then pass on to her brother and his comrades. She became a scout, a spy, a vital part of the shadow war being fought in the Missouri hills. For a time, it must have felt like a dangerous, righteous adventure. She was fighting alongside her brother, defending her family's beliefs. The risk was real, but so was the adrenaline, the sense of purpose. She was no longer just a girl playing piano, she was a player in the great bloody drama of her time. But this was no adventure, and the price of this war was about to be brought to her door in the most brutal way imaginable. In 1864, the hammer fell. Federal troops, tired of the constant raids and ambushes, hunted down Bud Shirley. He was trapped, cornered, and killed. For 16-year-old Myra, the news wasn't just devastating, it was the end of her world. The light of her life, her protector, her idol, was gone, slain by the very men she saw as foreign invaders. In that moment, her girlish patriotism and grief curdled into something far darker, a cold, permanent, all-consuming hatred. A hatred for the government, for its uniforms, for its laws. They had taken her brother, and in doing so, they had taken a part of her soul. The war might end for the country, but for Myra Shirley, it would never be over. She would spend the rest of her life fighting the victors. After the war, the Shirley family fled to Texas, seeking a new life from the ashes of the old. But for Myra, peace was a foreign country. Her heart, forged in hatred, was drawn to the fire. She found that fire in the eyes of the men who, like her brother Bud, refused to surrender. Men like the charismatic Cole Younger, a childhood friend and now a notorious outlaw. Rumors would later whisper of a passionate affair, claiming her daughter Pearl was his. It was a romantic story, but likely just that, a story. The truth, however, was no less dangerous. Her first husband was Jim Reed, another former bushwhacker who couldn't trade his pistol for a plow. With him, Myra stepped fully into the world of the outlaw. Their life was a blur of stolen horses and dodging posses, a frantic existence on the run. In this chaos, her two children, Pearl and Eddie, were born. But this was no family portrait. It was a partnership born of war and rebellion, and it was destined to end in blood. In 1874, Jim Reed's luck ran out. The news that reached Myra was cold and brutal. Her husband had been shot down, not in a blaze of glory, but by an acquaintance who valued the reward money more than friendship. At 26, Myra was a widow, a mother of two, and officially branded the accomplice of a dead bandit. This was the world she had chosen, a world with no honor among thieves. So she moved deeper into the shadows, to a place where the law of the United States was thin and the old ways were strong, the Indian Territory of Oklahoma. There, she met and married Sam Starr, a man from a proud Cherokee family. This wasn't just a marriage, it was the founding of a dynasty. On their land, tucked away in the rugged hills, they established a stronghold. It had a name that was a tribute to her old friends and a warning to her new enemies: Younger's Bend. Younger's Bend wasn't a ranch. It was a sanctuary for the damned. It was a place where men on the run, men like Jesse James and the Younger brothers themselves, could find a hot meal, a fresh horse, and a place to lay low, protected by the cunning of its queen. The air there was thick with the smell of wood smoke, whiskey, and paranoia. Every rider on the horizon was either a friend or a hangman. This was the heart of darkness, a kingdom built on stolen goods and guarded by guns. Here, the final transformation of Myra Maybelle Shirley was complete. She was no longer just a bandit's wife, she was the mastermind. She never led a charge, her hands weren't on the triggers during the robberies. Her weapons were her intellect and her will. She planned the heists, fenced the stolen property, bribed officials, and used her deep knowledge of the law to tangle up prosecutors in court. And she crafted an image that became a legend. She would ride into town on a fine horse, sitting side-saddle in a velvet dress like a proper lady, but on her hips, for all the world to see, rested 2 Colt revolvers. She could quote classical poetry one moment and arrange the sale of a stolen herd the next. This walking contradiction, the refined lady and the criminal queen, was her armor and her declaration of war. She had created a monster, and her name was Belle Starr. The 2 shotgun blasts echoed through the hills and then faded into an unnerving quiet. Belle Starr's horse, spooked and riderless, galloped the rest of the way to the ranch house, its panicked whinny the first alarm. Her daughter Pearl, hearing the sound, ran out to see what was wrong. The discovery she made in the mud of the road, just outside their own gate, would become the final bloody chapter of her mother's legend. The bandit queen was dead, her velvet riding habit stained with the earth and her own blood, her back riddled with buckshot. News of a murder like that travels fast, even in the isolated Indian territory. It moved from ranch to ranch on the lips of breathless riders, then crackled across the telegraph wires to the newspapers in Fort Smith and beyond. The death of Belle Starr was an event. For the lawmen, it was the closing of a long and frustrating case file. For the dime novelists, it was a dramatic ending they couldn't have written better themselves. For the locals, it was a source of fear and feverish gossip. The queen was dead. But who had dared to kill her? Soon enough, deputy U.S. Marshals rode down the trail to Younger's Bend. For years, this place had been a no-go zone, a sanctuary for fugitives where the law entered at its own peril. Now, they were in charge, picking through the life of the woman who had so often made fools of them. The investigation began, and the web of suspects was tangled and dark, spun from the threads of Belle's own life. Every person in her orbit had a potential motive. The first and most obvious suspect was a man named Edgar Watson. He was a tenant on Belle's land, a man with a shadowy past from Florida, rumored to be wanted for murder himself. They had argued bitterly. Belle wanted him gone, and Watson wasn't a man who liked being told what to do. It was a simple, logical motive. A dispute over land and money that ended in violence. But the simple answer isn't always the true one. Then there was her own husband, a Cherokee man named Jim July Starr. He was younger than Belle and was, at the time of her murder, facing his own trial for horse theft. Did they have a falling out? Was he driven by jealousy? Or, as some whispered, did he arrange the murder to silence her before she could testify in some secret deal with the law? He had an alibi, but in the murky world of Younger's Bend, an alibi was just another story. The silence that fell over the hills wasn't one of peace. It was a silence of fear. Belle's network of outlaws scattered, not knowing who among them might be next, or who might sell them out for a pardon. A reward was posted for information, but few dared to speak. The killer was still out there, and no one knew how far their reach extended. The hunt was on, not just for a murderer, but for the truth behind the final bloody act of the bandit queen's life. The wheels of justice turned slowly, but in the case of Belle Starr's murder, they seemed to grind through mud. The primary suspect, Edgar Watson, was finally brought to trial. You can just imagine the scene in the Fort Smith courtroom. It wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a spectacle. The room was packed with a tense mix of lawmen, curious townsfolk, and shadowed figures in the back rows, friends and enemies of the dead woman, all there to see how this final chapter would play out. The air itself felt heavy, thick with whispered theories and cold stares. Everyone had an opinion, and everyone was waiting for a conviction. The prosecution laid out its case. They painted a picture of a bitter dispute between a landlord and her troublesome tenant. They spoke of threats exchanged, of Watson's notorious temper, and of his presence near the scene of the crime. They presented him as a man with a motive, the means, and the opportunity. But their case was like a house built on sand. There was no murder weapon. There were no direct eyewitnesses to the shooting. The entire argument rested on bad blood and circumstantial evidence, a foundation that began to crumble under the slightest pressure. Watson, for his part, sat there with a cold confidence. He was no frightened farmer caught in the gears of the law. This was a man who understood the violence of the world. His defense lawyers didn't just deny his guilt. They threw the courtroom doors wide open to the chaos of Bell's life. They argued that putting only Edgar Watson on trial was absurd. Why not her husband, Jim July, who had his own legal troubles? Why not any of the dozens of spurned lovers, jilted partners, or vengeful victims Bell had created over the years? To have an enemy, they argued, was to be Belle Starr's acquaintance. And then, the darkest rumor of all, a chilling whisper that slithered through the courtroom, gave everyone pause. The story of Belle and her own son, Eddie. Their relationship was poison. He was a disappointment, and she was a harsh mother. The gossip was that just before her death, she had taken a whip to him for mistreating her favorite horse. Had the boy's resentment finally boiled over into an unspeakable act? Could he have pulled the trigger himself, or perhaps paid Watson to do it for him? It was a monstrous thought, but in the world Bell had built, it wasn't an impossible one. Faced with a weak case and a sea of reasonable doubt, the jury was trapped. They could condemn a man on suspicion, or they could let a potential killer walk free. They deliberated, and when they returned, the foreman's voice cut through the silence. "Not guilty." A shockwave went through the room. Edgar Watson, the man everyone was so sure had done it, stood up and walked out of the courtroom a free man. And so, the law of men had spoken. But was it justice? Or was it just a failure of a system that couldn't comprehend the complex, violent world of Younger's Bend? The court case was closed, but the murder remained unsolved. The killer had vanished back into the hills, becoming just another ghost in the bloody history of the territory. The truth, it seemed, was buried with the bandit queen. The murder of Belle Starr wasn't the end of the story. It was the explosion that scattered the pieces. Her kingdom, Younger's Bend, crumbled without its queen. The outlaws who had found sanctuary there drifted away, seeking new shadows to hide in. The land itself was eventually swallowed up by the relentless tide of settlement and progress. Today, what was once the most notorious hideout in the Indian Territory lies quiet and still, submerged beneath the placid waters of Lake Eufaula. A concrete historical marker stands on a nearby hill, a lone sentinel pointing toward the drowned land, the only official sign that this infamous chapter of the West ever happened here. The fates of those in her orbit were as tangled and often as tragic as her own. Edgar Watson, the acquitted suspect, moved on, but his reputation followed him. He eventually met a violent end himself, gunned down by a vigilante mob in Florida. Her last husband, Jim July Starr, died in a gunfight with lawmen not long after Bell's murder. Her son, Eddie Reed, who some whispered was the true killer, lived a troubled life, eventually becoming a deputy sheriff himself before being killed in a saloon brawl. It seems the violence that Belle had courted her whole life clung to those she left behind, an inescapable inheritance. But there is one final strange twist. Her daughter Pearl, the one rumored to be Cole Younger's child, chose a different path of rebellion. She turned her back on the world of guns and stolen horses and moved to Fort Smith, where she opened a high-class brothel. In a way, she too became a queen, presiding over her own illicit kingdom, a world with its own codes and dangers, just a stone's throw from the courthouse where her mother's killer had been set free. The strongest echo of Belle Starr, however, is not in the ground, but in the story itself. After her death, the legend took on a life of its own. A journalist named Richard Fox penned a lurid book called Belle Starr, the Bandit Queen, or the Female Jessie James. It was a work of pure fiction, filled with sensational tales of her leading bank robberies and stagecoach heists, things she never actually did. This book, and the countless dime novels that followed, created the image we think of today, the pistol-packing outlaw in a feathered hat. The myth completely consumed the woman. You can still visit her grave, tucked away in the woods not far from where Younger's Bend once stood. The original headstone, carved with a bell, a star, and a poignant poem, was chipped away to nothing by souvenir hunters over the decades. A new, protected monument stands in its place. And as you stand there, in the quiet of those Oklahoma hills, you realize the mountains do remember. They remember the real Myra Maybelle Shirley, the educated girl, the grieving sister, the cunning organizer, and the woman who gambled her life on a defiant dream of freedom and lost. So we return to the question that has hung in the air since those shotgun blasts first rang out. Who killed Belle Starr? The law of men never gave us a name. Was it the vengeful tenant, Edgar Watson? Was it one of her own family, a final, terrible betrayal? We will never know for sure. But maybe the real answer isn't a name. Maybe what killed Belle Starr was the violent, lawless world she had so carefully constructed around herself. In the end, the snake she had nurtured in the heart of Younger's Bend finally turned and bit its queen. Her story is a powerful reminder that the Civil War didn't truly end at Appomattox. It continued to rage in the hearts of people like Myra Shirley, leaving scars that festered into a deep and abiding hatred for the authority that had won. She was not a hero. She was not the cartoon villain of the penny press. She was a casualty, a woman whose fierce mountain pride, when poisoned by grief, became a force of self-destruction. She waged a 25-year war against a world she felt had wronged her, and in that war, there could only be one victor. Myra Maybelle Shirley was a woman of stark contradictions, the educated lady who could quote the classics and the ruthless godmother who ruled a den of thieves. She was born with the spirit of the mountains in her blood, proud, defiant, and unforgiving. But that spirit, when broken, forged a legend written in gunsmoke and blood. A girl who was meant to be a lady became the Bandit Queen, a cautionary tale that still echoes in the hills where she once rode. Here, on the banks of the Nolichucky River, the water still speaks in the old tongue of the mountains. It tumbles over rocks that have seen empires rise and fall, and it whispers through trees that remember a time when this was the very edge of the world. It was here, in this misty East Tennessee valley, that a man came and took the river's name for his own, branding himself into the landscape forever. They called him Nolichucky Jack. But was he a hero, a rebel, or a king in buckskin? Today, we're going to follow the current back in time, because these waters hold a story of fire, blood, and ambition that shaped the very soul of Appalachia. Let's go back to 1773. Imagine this valley not as a quiet, settled place, but as the raw, bleeding edge of a new continent. This was a world of towering hardwoods and shadow-filled hollows, where the law was whatever a man could enforce with a long rifle and a steady hand. The settlements here, places like Watauga and Holston, weren't towns. They were clusters of raw log cabins huddled together for warmth and safety, islands in a vast, untamed wilderness. This was land that was promised by God, but forbidden by a king across the ocean, and more importantly, it was the ancestral hunting ground of the Cherokee. Into this crucible walked John Sevier. He wasn't born of these mountains. He was a man from Virginia with a hunger for land that was sharper than any axe. When he arrived and built his home on the Nolichucky, he didn't look like a mountain-born brawler. He was handsome, charming, with a gaze that could disarm a rival or win the loyalty of a stranger in a single glance. He had the easy smile of a man who knew deep in his bones that you'd follow him, that you'd trust him with your life. But those who looked closer saw something else. Beneath the charisma was a core of cold, hard steel. This wasn't just a farmer looking for a homestead. This was a born leader, a speculator, a man who saw this forbidden land not just as a home, but as an empire in the making. He was building a life here with his wife and children, but every nail he hammered was an act of defiance against a distant government and a declaration of war against the people who had called this place home for centuries. The air itself was thick with tension. To the west, Cherokee leaders like Dragging Canoe watched the endless stream of settlers and swore a blood oath to drive them back across the mountains. To the east, the whispers of rebellion against the British Crown were growing into a roar. Sevier and his neighbors were caught in the middle, squatters on stolen land, poised on the brink of a war that would force them to choose a side. They had come seeking freedom, but they had found themselves in a powder keg, and John Sevier was the man holding the match. To really understand what forged John Sevier from a simple settler into a legend, you can't just look at maps or read treaties. You have to feel the weight of the times. I'm holding a piece of that weight right here in my hands. It's a trade tomahawk, the kind that were mass-produced in English foundries. The iron head is simple, brutal, and efficient. The hickory handle is smooth from a century of handling. It feels cold, balanced, and deadly. But this isn't just an antique weapon. This is a political document written in steel. When the revolution began, the British had a strategy for their southern frontier: turn the mountains red. They funneled weapons like this one to the Cherokee and other tribes, encouraging them to attack the rebellious settlements. For the British, it was a calculated move in a global war. But for the families living in those isolated cabins, it meant this object became a symbol of their worst nightmares. It was the face of a war that didn't happen on distant battlefields, but on their own doorsteps. This simple tool forces us to ask a visceral question, one that cuts through the pages of history. What happens when the world outside your thin wooden walls is consumed by fire and screams? What does a man like John Sevier do when he's looking over the palisade of a besieged fort and sees a young woman running for her life, with a weapon just like this one slicing through the air right behind her? When the revolution finally broke, it wasn't a glorious affair of flags and cannons on the frontier. It was a wave of pure terror. The British strategy was simple and brutal. They would unleash their allies, the Cherokee, upon the settlements. The war had come to the mountains, and it came on silent, moccasined feet, armed with English steel. Suddenly, every rustle in the woods, every shadow at dusk, could mean death. Cabins were burned, families scattered, and the survivors fled to the flimsy security of their forts. At Fort Watauga, the air was thick with the stench of fear and gunpowder. Hundreds of Cherokee warriors, led by the brilliant and implacable Dragging Canoe, materialized from the forest and laid siege to the crude wooden walls. Inside, John Sevier was no longer just a landowner. He was a commander, responsible for the lives of every man, woman, and child huddled within. The siege was a grinding nightmare of sniper fire, of terrifying war cries that echoed through the night, a constant reminder that death was only a few feet of log wall away. It was during this chaos that the legend of Nolichucky Jack was truly born. A young woman, Catherine Sherrill, was caught outside the walls when the attack began. As she sprinted across the cleared ground toward the fort, she was a lone figure of desperation. She could hear the footsteps pounding behind her, could feel the nearness of her pursuers. A tomahawk, a weapon just like this one, its polished edge glinting in the sun, whizzed past her ear and thudded into the gate just as she reached it. It was barred shut. For a heart-stopping second, her hope died. But from the top of the wall, John Sevier had seen it all. As Catherine, in a final act of pure will, leapt for the top of the palisade, his hands shot out, grabbing her arms and hauling her over the edge to safety. In that single breathtaking moment, Sevier became more than a man. He became a protector, a hero. The seeds of conflict, sown by a distant king, had just bloomed into a very personal war for him, and that heroic rescue planted the seeds of a love story that would itself become a cornerstone of Appalachian folklore. History books can give you the dates and the names, but they can't give you the soul of a story. For that, you have to talk to the people who are its living keepers. My search for the soul of the King's Mountain story led me to the back room of a county historical society, a place that smelled of old paper and cedar. It's there I met a local historian, a man in his 80s whose family had been in these hills since before Tennessee was even a dream. His name isn't important. What is important is that the stories of this place run in his blood. I asked him about Major Ferguson's threat. Why did it light such a fire? Why march over a frozen mountain on what looked like a suicide mission? He leaned back in his creaky wooden chair and gave me a look that said I was asking the wrong question entirely. "You have to understand," he said, his voice a low Appalachian rumble. "Ferguson didn't threaten an army. There was no army. He threatened their hearthstones." He explained that these weren't soldiers who answered to a distant general. They were clans. They were families. Their loyalty was to the man whose land bordered their own, to the neighbor who helped them raise a barn. When Patrick Ferguson promised to hang their leaders and lay their country waste with fire and sword, it wasn't a threat of war. It was a promise of annihilation aimed directly at their wives, their children, and their homes. "My great-great-great-uncle was there," the old man continued, tapping a weathered finger on a map. "Family law says he was plowing a field when the rider came with the news. He didn't even unhitch the mule. He just dropped the reins, walked into his cabin, took his long rifle from over the fireplace, and told his wife he'd be back when it was done." That single image, passed down through generations, tells you more than any history book. This wasn't a political calculation. It was a personal insult, a blood feud declared on an entire people. And it was an insult that could only be answered one way. Major Patrick Ferguson's threat was a spark on dry tinder. It wasn't heard in a government hall. It was carried by riders from one isolated settlement to the next, a whispered promise of hellfire that spread through the mountains like a contagion of rage. This wasn't a challenge to an army. It was a personal insult, a vow to burn out the very heart of the over-mountain people. And in that moment, something shifted in the soul of the frontier. The time for talk was over. The time for defense was over. This was now a hunt. The gathering at Sycamore Shoals was not a military muster. It was a human flood. Men poured out of the hollows and down from the ridges, their faces set like stone. They were a rough-hewn army, clad in buckskin and homespun, their only uniform a shared fury. Their weapon was the American long rifle, a tool of subsistence that had become an instrument of vengeance. They left their plows in the field, their harvests in the barn, and their families with a grim promise to return. In the center of this storm of men stood John Sevier. Alongside Isaac Shelby, he was the axis around which this whole desperate enterprise turned. He didn't need to give speeches. His presence was enough. He moved through the camp, his piercing gaze meeting the eyes of farmers and hunters, transforming their individual anger into a singular, deadly purpose. He was one of them, but he was also more. He was the embodiment of their defiance. The decision was made. They would not wait for Ferguson to bring his fire and sword to them. They would take the war to him. They would do the unthinkable, march over the high, snow-dusted peaks of the Appalachians, leaving their own homes vulnerable to hunt down a superior British force. This was the point of no return. As they turned their faces east and began their climb into the freezing autumn air, they were no longer just settlers. They were an avalanche of buckskin and fury, and they would not stop until they had buried Ferguson and his army on a mountain of his own choosing. Today, Kings Mountain is a place of profound peace. You can walk the paved trails, hear the wind rustling the leaves, and read the solemn granite monuments that mark the place where a battle turned the tide of a war. But the true evidence, the real scar left on this landscape, isn't carved in stone. It's the land itself. You have to leave the path and feel the ground under your feet to understand what happened here. This isn't a mountain in the way you might imagine. It's a long, steep-sided ridge that rises abruptly from the surrounding country. When Major Ferguson brought his loyalist army up here, he thought he had found the perfect fortress. From this high ground, he could see in every direction, and he believed no army could assault such a steep, rugged slope. He was so confident, he reportedly boasted that he was king of this mountain, and that God Almighty and all the rebels out of hell could not drive him from it. He saw a fortress. He failed to understand that he was choosing a tomb, right here. Stand at the bottom of the slope and look up. You can feel the steepness in your legs and your lungs. This is where it happened. Ferguson's men were arrayed on the cleared summit, a perfect target against the skyline. But the over-mountain men didn't attack in formation. They used the dense woods on these slopes for cover, melting between the very trees that still stand here today. Each of these ancient oaks, each of these weathered rock outcroppings, became a silent testament to the chaos of that day. This whole ridge became a killing jar, and the over-mountain men were about to seal the lid. It began with a sound that was not quite human. From the base of the mountain on all sides, a terrifying chorus of whoops and yells erupted from the trees, the sound of panthers, of wolves, of men who had become something primal. The over-mountain men didn't march. They swarmed up the wooded slopes, a relentless tide of buckskin and iron will. It was a kind of warfare the British had never truly understood. For every volley of musketry the Loyalists fired down the hill, hitting little more than bark and shadow. A dozen puffs of white smoke would answer from the trees below. The crack of the long rifles was sharp, personal. Each one was a sentence of death delivered from an unseen judge. A man in a bright red coat would be reloading on the summit, and then he would simply fold, vanishing into the chaos. The Loyalists charged with bayonets, a wave of disciplined steel meant to break any line, but there was no line to break. The frontiersmen just melted back into the forest, letting the charge pass, only to rise up on their flanks and rear, their rifles speaking again and again. The fortress had become a slaughter pen. Above the din, Major Ferguson's silver whistle could be heard, a shrill, piercing note trying to impose order on pure chaos. He rode his white horse back and forth across the summit, a magnificent, defiant target rallying his crumbling lines. For an hour, the mountain was consumed by a storm of lead and fury. The air grew heavy and acrid with the smell of gunpowder. The roar of battle was continuous, a deafening drumbeat of rifle fire, screams and war cries. Then, suddenly, the silver whistle fell silent. The man on the white horse, who had seemed invincible just moments before, reeled in his saddle. He swayed for a moment, a stunned look on his face, before sliding to the ground. With his fall, the last bit of fight drained from the Loyalist force. White handkerchiefs began to appear, tied to the ends of ramrods and held aloft in surrender. The shooting didn't stop immediately. The raw fury that had carried them over a frozen mountain demanded a final terrible price. But soon, a new sound replaced the gunfire, the triumphant, breathless roar of men who knew they had just broken the back of the British war in the south. After the gun smoke clears, the ink begins to flow. This is a copy of the official report on the Battle of King's Mountain, written by the commanders and sent to the Continental Congress. It's written in the formal, looping script of the 18th century, and its language is as detached as the battle itself was intimate and brutal. It talks of troop movements, of casualties, and of objectives secured. It describes the battle in a single, sanitized phrase: a sharp conflict. A sharp conflict. Those three words are the cold ashes left over from a raging fire. There is no mention in this dry report of the war cries that echoed through the trees, or the raw fury of men avenging a threat against their homes. The official record doesn't tell you about the terror in the eyes of the loyalists as they were swarmed from all sides, or the grim satisfaction of the frontiersmen as they won. The paperwork of war is always a ghost of the real thing, a sterile summary that strips away the blood and the humanity. And this is where the story of John Sevier takes its most important turn. In this document, he is a hero of the new United States, a loyal officer serving the cause of liberty. But what this paper trail doesn't show is what was happening in Sevier's own mind. He had just seen how power was won, not in distant congresses, but by the will of determined men with rifles in their hands. As he rode home over the mountains, a hero of continental fame, he wasn't just thinking about the war he had won, he was thinking about the kingdom he was about to build. The official record sealed his legend as a patriot, but it was a title he was already preparing to betray. The hero returned from Kings Mountain not just to a home, but to a vacuum of power. North Carolina, broke and exhausted from the war, ceded its western lands to the federal government, effectively abandoning the over-mountain settlements. Left without courts, laws, or protection, the people did what they had always done. They took matters into their own hands. In 1784, they declared themselves a new, independent state, the state of Franklin, and there was only one man they would trust to be its governor, John Sevier. For a brief, shining moment, Nolichucky Jack was a king in his own right, ruling over a renegade republic carved out of the wilderness. But the law, however distant, has a long memory. North Carolina quickly regretted its decision and reasserted its claim, creating chaos. Two governments now claimed the same land. The conflict became a bitter personal feud between Sevier and a man named John Tipton, a former brother-in-arms from Kings Mountain who now led the North Carolina Loyalist faction. This wasn't a political debate, it was a civil war in miniature, a clash of two frontier titans who refused to bend. The breaking point came in the dead of winter. Tipton's faction, acting for North Carolina, seized some of Sevier's enslaved people as payment for back taxes. For Sevier, this was the ultimate insult. Enraged, he raised a small army and laid siege to Tipton's farm. The Battle of Franklin was a tragic farce played out in a blizzard. For days, the two sides traded insults and gunfire from behind fences and trees until a surprise attack by Tipton's reinforcements shattered Sevier's force. The state of Franklin collapsed in the snow and mud, and its governor was now a wanted man. The law's pursuit began. The hero of Kings Mountain was now a fugitive, hiding in the very mountains that had once hailed him as their savior. He was hunted by the government of North Carolina, the state he had once defended so ferociously. The cheers of victory were replaced by the quiet footsteps of a man on the run, a king with no kingdom, charged with the high crime of treason. Eventually, the law caught up with him. He wasn't captured in a blaze of glory, but arrested quietly, a shocking humiliation for a man of his stature. They put him in irons. Imagine that sight. Nolichucky Jack, the Indian fighter, the revolutionary commander, being hauled back over the mountains, not as a hero, but as a common felon. The tense journey ended at the courthouse in Morganton, North Carolina, where he was to be tried for his life. But as he stood before the court, a different kind of justice arrived. A mob of his armed followers stormed the building, freed him from his captors, and set him back on his horse. The official verdict was never delivered, because the people of the frontier had already delivered their own. John Sevier simply rode away, a free man, proving that in Appalachia, the loyalty of the people could be a law unto itself. To find the final chapter of this story, you have to visit two very different pieces of ground. The first is here, on the lawn of the old Knox County Courthouse, in the heart of the city he helped build. A grand stone monument marks the final resting place of John Sevier. It proclaims him a hero, a patriot, the first governor of the state of Tennessee. He lies here in a place of ultimate public honor, celebrated as a founding father. But as you stand here, you can't help but feel the paradox. This is the grave of a man who was once arrested, put in irons, and charged with high treason. To understand the other side of that conflict, you have to travel a few miles away to a quieter place. Here, on the rolling farmland that was once his home, lies John Tipton. His grave is simple, solid, unyielding, much like the man himself who stood for the law when it was unpopular and faced down the most famous man on the frontier. He rests on the very land he defended, the homestead that Sevier himself once besieged. They lie just a county apart now, enemies in life, neighbors in death. The man who upheld the law rests on his private farm, while the rebel who defied him is enshrined in the town square. This stark contrast, written in granite and soil, is the final, silent testament to their long and bitter feud. It forces us to ask the most crucial question of all. What happened in the years after the guns fell silent? How did the fugitive Nolichucky Jack not only escape justice, but rise from the ashes of his failed state to become the most powerful man in Tennessee? The long shadow of his failed state hung over John Sevier, but he was a man who thrived in the half-light. After his dramatic rescue, he was still technically a fugitive, a traitor in the eyes of North Carolina. But in the mountains and hollows of his homeland, he was simply Nolichucky Jack, their leader, protected by a fierce loyalty that no law could penetrate. He was a political ghost they couldn't exorcise. So what does a man do when his kingdom has crumbled and his enemies hold all the legal cards? He finds a new game to play. And this is where Sevier's story takes a dark, secretive turn. A desperate man, he began a clandestine correspondence with Spanish diplomats. He hinted that the frustrated people of the frontier, feeling abandoned by the United States, might be willing to secede entirely and place themselves under the protection of the King of Spain in exchange for free navigation of the Mississippi River. Was it genuine treason? Or was it the shrewdest political bluff in American history? A move designed to force the young United States to finally pay attention to its western frontier. The truth is buried with him, but it shows a man willing to risk everything to protect his interests and regain his power. Meanwhile, North Carolina faced a dilemma. They couldn't arrest Sevier. His followers would simply free him again. They couldn't ignore him. His influence was too great. They couldn't defeat him, so they did the only thing they could. They embraced him. In a stunning act of political pragmatism, they issued a full pardon for his treason. Then, they went a step further. They elected the rebel leader to their own state senate. It was a masterstroke. By bringing him into the system, they neutralized him as an outlaw. But they had underestimated Nolichucky Jack. He wasn't neutralized. He was legitimized. He took his seat in the government that had once hunted him and used his new position, combined with his undiminished popularity back home, to fight for the one thing he always wanted, a new state. But this time, done the right way. He outmaneuvered every opponent, trading his buckskin jacket for a politician's coat without ever losing the grit of the frontiersman. When Tennessee was finally granted statehood in 1796, there was no debate, no question about who would lead it. The election of John Sevier as its first governor wasn't a political victory. It was a coronation. The rebel king was dead. Long live the governor. And that's where the story gets complicated, because even today, John Sevier isn't one man, he's two. The first Sevier is the one written in stone and bronze, the man on the monument. This is Nolichucky Jack the hero, the father of Tennessee, the fearless Indian fighter who protected the fledgling settlements from annihilation. To this day, if you ask the descendants of the Overmountain men, they will tell you he was a patriot who risked everything at Kings Mountain and a statesman who carved a civilization from a savage wilderness. This is the Sevier of public record and popular legend. But then there's the other John Sevier. This is the man whose story isn't written on monuments, but whispered in the shadows of history. To understand this Sevier, you have to stand on the other side of the Nolichucky River, on the land that was once the sovereign territory of the Cherokee Nation. From that perspective, Sevier wasn't a hero. He was the leading edge of an invasion. He wasn't a protector. He was a conqueror. Every acre of land he settled was an acre of land he took. His 35 battles weren't heroic skirmishes. They were a relentless campaign of ethnic cleansing. And it wasn't just about land for a home. The second Sevier was a ruthless speculator, a man whose patriotism and personal profit were always tangled together. His renegade state of Franklin looks less like a noble experiment in democracy and more like a massive land grab, an attempt to secure his and his cronies' illegal claims. His flirtation with Spain wasn't a bluff. It was the act of a man whose ultimate loyalty was to his own ambition. So who was the real Nolichucky Jack? Was he the courageous patriot or the greedy opportunist? The community builder or the dispossessor of a people? The truth is, he was all of it. He was a man who contained the violent, contradictory, and deeply flawed soul of the American frontier itself. And to this day in Appalachia, the version of the story you hear still depends entirely on which side of the mountain your family came from. When a man's life is as large and loud as John Sevier's, it doesn't just end when he's laid in the ground. It seeps into the soil. It becomes part of the mist that hangs in the hollows. The hard facts of his life, the battles, the politics, the betrayals, began to soften over the decades, smoothed over by time like river stones, until a new shape emerged, the shape of a legend. The most powerful legends are often the ones people needed to be true. Take the story that he fought in over 30 battles and was never once wounded. Historically, it's an incredible feat of luck and skill. But in the telling and retelling around a hearthfire, it became something more. It became proof. In a world of constant, random violence, where a snakebite or a fever could kill as surely as a tomahawk, the belief that their leader was untouchable, that he was shielded by Providence itself, wasn't just a story. It was a shield for their own hearts. But every bright legend casts a long shadow. There's another kind of story you'll hear in East Tennessee, one told in a hushed voice after the children are in bed. They say that on certain nights, when the moon is hidden and the river fog is thick, you can still hear the echoes of his forgotten wars down by the Nolichucky. They say it isn't Sevier's ghost you have to worry about. It's the ghosts of those he fought, the Cherokee spirits still bound to the land he took, their whispers of anger and loss carried on the water. It became a cautionary tale, a way for the mountains themselves to remember the price that was paid for the state he built. And so, the man became a myth. He is both the invincible hero protected by heaven and the haunted figure whose deeds left unquiet spirits in his wake. The history books tell you what John Sevier did, but it's the folklore, the ghost stories, and the tall tales whispered from one generation to the next that tell you how the mountains remember him. So we find ourselves back where we started, here on the banks of the Nolichucky. The river still speaks its ancient language, tumbling over the same stones, but we hear it differently now. We can no longer see this as just a quiet valley. We see the ghosts. We see the raw frontier, the smoke of the cabin, and the determined figure of a man who took the river's name and made it his own, bending a wilderness to his will. The journey to understand John Sevier is to understand that our heroes are never simple. It's easy to want the man on the monument to be the whole story, a flawless patriot cast in bronze. But the Appalachian frontier was no place for simple men. It demanded men who were as complex and contradictory as the land itself, men who could be both courageous and cruel, builders and destroyers, heroes and villains, sometimes all in the space of a single day. Sevier wasn't a good man who did bad things, or a bad man who did good things. He was a man of his time, and his time was a storm. So the next time you pass a forgotten ruin on a lonely road, or see an old name carved into a county courthouse, remember that it's not just a pile of stones or a word on a map. It's a library filled with stories of love, loss, and the brutal choices that define us. The story of Nolichucky Jack is a reminder that our history is not a clean, straight line. It's a tangled, bloody, and glorious thicket, and it's in those shadows and contradictions that the truest stories are found. The people are gone. The houses are gone. The world they fought for has vanished, but the story remains. On a frigid December night in 1831, deep in the mountains, a man named Charlie Silver vanished from his one-room cabin, found his body dismembered, burned in the hearth, and buried beneath the floorboards. The newspapers screamed of a jealous monster who butchered her husband with an axe. But under the laws of that time, Frankie Silver was forbidden from speaking a single word in her own defense. So what really happened in that isolated cabin? Was this the cold-blooded act of a she-devil, or was it the desperate last stand girl with no other way out? To understand what happened, you have to understand the world they lived in. It wasn't even a settlement. This was the raw, untamed heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains in the early 1830s, a place carved from rock and hardship. Their home was a single-room log. The wind didn't just whistle through the gaps in the logs, it moaned. The mountains weren't just a backdrop, they were a green cage, beautiful and deadly. It cut you off from a relentless battle for survival. Their entire universe was contained walls, with a dirt floor under their feet and a stone hearth that was the center of their existence. It was where they cooked, where they slept, where they found their only defense against the bone-deep cold of a mountain winter. It was a place of immense intimacy, but also a place with nowhere to hide, where every frustration and every dark thought had room to escape. Charlie Silver was just 19, but he was a man of the woods. He lived by his rifle and his traps, often disappearing for days at a time, deer or checking his lines for beaver and fox. He was young, strong, and restless, a man who understood the language of the wilderness far better than the quiet, contained life of a husband and father. He was the one who and the meat for their table back to that isolated cabin. And in that cabin was Frankie. At 18, she was already a wife and a mother to their one-year-old daughter, Nancy. While Charlie roamed the mountains, her world shrank to the size of that single room. Her days were measured by the cry of her baby, the crackle of the fire, and the deafening silence of the hollows. That kind of isolation can do strange things to a person. It can sharpen your fears until they have a razor's edge, and it can make the four walls of your home feel like a tomb. You can imagine their life was a cycle of hard work, long waits, and the brief, simple relief of reunion. The smell of wood smoke, the sound of an axe splitting firewood, burning through the trees with game slung over his shoulder. This was their ordinary life. This was the world they had built, fragile as it was. But the winter of 1831 was coming, and it carried a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. Conflict that ended Charlie Silver's life didn't begin that December night. Its seeds were planted generations before in the very soil of those mountains. You have to remember who these people were. They were the descendants of Scots pioneers, a people known for their fierce independence and their stubborn refusal to bow to anyone. They hadn't been given this land, they had tamed it. They had wrestled sides, fighting the woods, the winters, and sometimes each other for every acre. This land held memories of blood. It was not a peaceful place. Many of their grandfathers had been over-mountain men, the frontier riflemen who fought with brutal efficiency in the Revolution. They learned a hard lesson in those days, that the only law you can truly count on is the one you enforce yourself. That belief seeped into the ground and rose up like a mountain mist. They distrusted authority from distant towns they settled their own disputes, often with a fist or a rifle, and they kept their secrets locked tight within the family. To be a Silver in that part of the country meant something. They were known as a hardy clan of hunters and trappers, men who knew the mountains like the back of their own calloused hands. They were proud, quick-tempered, and not to be crossed. A Silver man was expected to be the master of his 100 acres of woodland or the four walls of a one-room cabin. For a young man like Charlie to carry, a pressure to be tough, to be in control, to never show weakness. Frankie came from the Stewart clan, people just as tough and rooted as the... When she married Charlie, she crossed a line. She became a Silver. In that world, A woman's identity was tied completely to her husband. Her reputation was his reputation. Her duty was to him. This wasn't a partnership of equals. It was a hierarchy as old and as unyielding as the... Frankie wasn't just a related wife. She was an outsider who now lived under the formidable shadow of the Silver name. In a place this isolated, the only thing that traveled faster than a winter storm was a rumor. And the air around the Silver cabin had grown thick with them. The community wasn't just a collection of distant neighbors, a web of eyes and ears. Every family was connected by blood, marriage, or shared hardship, and they all kept a close watch on one another. The two most watchful sets of eyes belonged to Charlie's father, Jacob, and his brother, John. The Silvers looked after their own, and from the start, they viewed Frankie, the Stewart girl, with a certain suspicion. Her as the outsider who had taken one of their boys. Whispers followed Charlie Silver when he came down from the mountains. Some said he had a temper that could flare up like a flash flood, especially when he'd been drinking. The hollow of a young man growing restless and bitter with the heavy burdens passed from cabin to cabin. These weren't necessarily malicious tales. They were just the way mountain people took the measure of a man. But each story added it was slowly tightening around that little cabin. It was slowly tightening around that little cabin. The most poisonous rumor of all was that Charlie was planning to leave, not just for a long hunt, but for good. The story went and that he planned to take their daughter Nancy and head west, where a man could start over. Some versions of the rumor even gave his plan a name, another woman waiting for him somewhere down the trail. For a young wife like Frankie, alone and entirely dependent on her husband, this wasn't just gossip. It was a death sentence. You have to understand, these whispers weren't just idle talk. Reputation, they were stones being thrown. Frankie would have felt their impact every day. A neighbor who wouldn't quite meet her eye. A sudden silence when she approached a group of women at the creek. The air in that community and hidden tensions long before Charlie disappeared. The isolation of her cabin became a social quarantine, leaving and a husband who, the whispers said, was ready to abandon her. So the whispers said, was ready to abandon her. So when that fateful December arrived, the stage was already set. This wasn't a December arrived, the stage was already set. This wasn't a sudden storm breaking over a clear sky. This was the culmination of months up behind a cracking dam. The neighbors were whispering, the neighbors were whispering, and inside that one room cabin, a silent, bitter war was being waged. A silent, bitter war was being waged. The mountains have a way of talking to those who know how to listen. And in the weeks leading up to that, Christmas, they were screaming. The old folks would later say the winter of 1831 came on with an unnatural bitterness, a cold that felt personal, like a premonition. Cried from the ridges with a sound that wasn't just a call, but a shiver. Looking for a spine to run down. In the folklore of those hills, a screech owl calling near a home was a death warning, a sign that a soul was about to be claimed. And the owls, they say, were crying nightly over the silver. Most dangerous omen why? It was sitting across the hearth. Charlie Silver become a stranger. It was sitting across the hearth. Charlie Silver become a stranger. The restlessness that had always been part of him had curdled into something darker. He was a caged animal, pacing the confines of his small life, and his eyes were fixed on the distant promise of the West. Every mention of leaving, every coin he saved, was a threat. He was the human catalyst, the walking, breathing prophecy of the disaster to come. Frankie felt it. She felt it in the pit of her stomach, a cold knot that had nothing to do with the winter. Stand in the doorway of the cabin with baby Nancy on her hip and look out at the woods. The familiar trees now seemed to cast long, grasping fingers of shadow. The wind whistling through the hollow sounded like it was whispering we couldn't quite understand. It was a suffocating, the feeling you get when you're standing on a precipice in the dark. She couldn't have known what was knew with every fiber of her being that her world was about to be torn apart. The night of December 22nd, 1830, flickering shadows that danced on the rough-hewn log walls. The baby, Nancy, was asleep, and in that the final act began. We will never know the exact words that were spoken between Frankie and Charlie, point from which there could be no. Perhaps it happened just as the prosecution later claimed. Charlie, his mind set on a new life in the West, finally told her. Maybe he said it calmly, maybe he said it cruelly. He was leaving. He was taking the money they had scraped together. And most devastating of all, the money they had scraped together. And most devastating of all, he was taking their Frankie. This would have been a declaration of war, slow starvation and disgrace in the wilderness. In that moment, he ceased to be her husband and became the man who was going to steal her child and destroy her world. Or maybe the mountain legend is true. Maybe Charlie came home that night not with a plan, but with a bomb inside him. Maybe an argument over nothing exploded into violence. The legend whispers that he threatened Frankie, that he even threatened to harm maybe. In this version, Frankie wasn't a woman scorned, she was a mother protecting her young. He wasn't a man with a dream of the West. He was a drunken monster who had brought the terror of the outside world into the one place she was supposed to be safe. Whichever story is true, the result was the same. A final, unbearable choice was forced upon Frankie Silver. And in that cabin, there was a tool. It was an axe,